So today we're going to cover the case of the Coleman family murders. He was not a nice dad. He literally didn't care about the well-being of anyone around him, including his kids. This has to be the biggest, meatiest, most confusing case that I've ever researched. He is evil, he is narcissistic, he is a predator, and he thought that he could do whatever he wanted and get away with it.
Oh, the scum, the scrounge, the shameless mick.
So I know I say this a lot, but prepare yourselves for this one. And I do have a little bit of a backstory on how I discovered this case. So I was one day watching Criminal Minds, as you do. And I was watching season 7, don't know the exact episode number, but the episode was called Hope. So basically a man kidnaps this 8-year-old girl and he grooms her for years. He sexually assaults her. He gets her pregnant at one point as well. And then he starts calling this girl his wife. Now it's thought that he wanted to actually marry this girl, so he kidnapped her and groomed her to one day become his wife. And for those of you that don't know, Criminal Minds, some of their episodes are actually based on real cases. And when I was watching that episode, I was just like, no, this can't be real. Like, this is too far-fetched. Like, this did not happen. But unfortunately, it did. When I found out that that episode was based on a true case, I could not believe it. I was like, no way in hell. I was just in complete, utter disbelief. And the case that we're going to be covering today is of Franklin Delano Floyd. And if it's even possible, the true story of Franklin Delano Floyd is even worse than that Criminal Minds episode. You guys are going to be so angry, heartbroken about this case, this man, or makes my blood boil. I know I say that a lot, but truly, Franklin, oh my God. But there is one tragic story that is at the center of this case, and that is the story of Franklin's main victim, a young girl called Suzanne Savakis. But I wanted to bring Suzanne's story to you guys for the longest time, and it's truly hard to even get your head around some of the things that happen in this case. Like, how did that even happen? And we have a lot to get through today. This is possibly going to be my longest video ever on my channel. So don't just grab a whole snack, grab a whole 3 or 5 course meal. We're going to be here for a very, very long time, and let's just jump in. Franklin Delano Floyd was born on the 17th of June, 1943, making him a Gemini. He grew up in Barnesville, Georgia, and he is the youngest of 5 siblings to parents Thomas and Della Floyd. Now, as we see with a lot of these cases, Franklin's childhood was not a good one. And this one in particular was really terrible. He went through a lot as a child. Franklin's dad was a very violent alcoholic, and he would routinely beat his wife and children with a belt. Violence was a common occurrence in that household. It was all that Franklin knew for his early years. And the violence was that bad that the whole family would actually hide under the bed whenever Franklin's father would return home from work, because literally as soon as he walked through the door, he would inflict violence on someone. Everyone just used to stay out of his way, basically. That was the only way to survive in that household. But when Franklin was still a baby, his dad did pass away from liver and kidney failure from abusing alcohol. So you're probably thinking like, okay, well, the dad's no longer around. Do things get better now? Well, they don't. If it's possible, it actually gets worse. Franklin's mom decided that she could no longer take care of the 5 children. So in the January of 1946, when Franklin was just 2 years old, his mom dropped Franklin and his other 4 siblings off at a local orphanage. Now, at the time, she thought that she was doing the right thing. She couldn't afford or provide for her 5 children now that her husband had passed away. But that could not be further from the truth, because this home was not a very nice one, let's just put it that way. The children were raised in a horrible way. Like, it was just a very strict, unbearable kind of home. It was a very cramped. The facilities were not very good. A lot of the time, the children had to sleep 10 a room. They were also fed an extremely restrictive diet, and sometimes the children were even starved as a form of punishment. So yeah, this home, and I'm just literally going over the most basic things of this home, but this home was not a good home, and Franklin's time at this home was absolutely terrible. There was also violence at this house as well. The children were routinely beaten up for even just the smallest things. But it wasn't just the staff that were mean to the children. The children were also mean to each other. further as well. The whole home was just full of violence. Fights would often break out between the children, and Franklin was often a target because the other children in the home thought that he was too sensitive and feminine. The other children would beat him up, they would laugh at him, they would ridicule him. And then one day, a group of boys found Franklin in a field that was near the home, and they raped him with a broom handle. I just don't know why children would think to do that to another child. I mean, obviously anyone, but I'm talking about children here. Why would they do that? And it only gets worse from here. As Franklin got older, he started to rebel a little bit more. He would run away, he would steal things, he would start to argue back at the staff at the home, and this just led to more severe beatings, more violence. He was whipped all the time with leather belts. And on another occasion, Franklin's hand was forced into a pot of boiling water because he was caught masturbating, which it's like, what the hell? And things went on like this for years. You've got to remember that Franklin was only 2 years old when he was placed in this home, and he eventually escaped the home when he was 16 years old. So for 14 years, this was what Franklin's life was like. And when Franklin did manage to escape the home at 16 years old, this would be for good. He would never return back to the orphanage. That was obviously a very brief summary because we have a lot to get through, but wow, a terrible upbringing. I think it's hard to even imagine how awful Franklin's life was when he was growing up. But even when he was at home the first 2 years of his life, that was still filled with violence. Since the moment Franklin was born, all he has known is violence. So after escaping the home, Franklin doesn't know what to do. Like, he has nowhere to go. And he ends up just drifting around, turning to crime to get by. It was even at this point when he escapes the home that he manages to track down his birth mom, which I don't know how he did that because he's obviously been in this home for a very long time, but he manages to track down his birth mom, and he was probably hoping for a really lovely reunion, but that is not what he got. When Franklin found his mom, she was currently a sex worker. She didn't have any interest at all in getting to know Franklin, getting to know anything about him, having any sort of relationship with him. She was not bothered at all. She did not care about the welfare of Franklin, about the welfare of any of her children. Earlier on, when I said, oh, she thought she was doing the right thing, she thought that she couldn't provide for them, but her reaction to Franklin when he does find her kind of makes you think, okay, so did she not really care about any of her children and she just wanted to get them out the way? And then not long after Franklin found his mom, she disappeared again on him. She just didn't want anything to do with him. And this had a significant impact on Franklin because all over again, he felt like he was abandoned again by his mom. And after this, Franklin's life of crime goes into overdrive. He drifts all over the US. He goes from Philadelphia to Atlanta to New York, Miami, committing thefts and burglaries left, right, and center until eventually he lands in LA. And when he's in LA, he is currently completely broke and completely desperate, and he breaks into a store to try and steal a gun. And this plan of stealing a gun, I honestly don't know why he wanted to steal a gun. Like, I don't know what he was planning with that, but it completely backfired, and the police soon turn up and a little bit of a gunfight breaks out, and Franklin gets shot in the stomach. But he did survive. He went through quite intensive surgery, and then Franklin lands himself in a youth institution where he spends the next 13 months. The first of many prison spells to come. That is something that is really infuriating about this case, because Franklin goes to prison quite a few times, but he still manages to commit the crimes that he does. It's just like, how? So Franklin, after the 13 months, is released from the youth institution. He is currently 19 years old. This time in the youth institution didn't change Franklin at all, because pretty much straight away he's back to committing crime. In fact, it was just a month after being released from the youth institution that Franklin would go on to commit the worst crime that he's committed so far. And I do have to give a warning right now because we are going to be talking about child sexual abuse. So after being released from the youth institution, Franklin moves back to Georgia, and he was now living right next to the very orphanage that he grew up in, which has got to be significant. It has to be, the fact that he's gone back almost to the orphanage. So just one day in June of 1962, Franklin walked into a bowling alley that wasn't too far from the orphanage and abducted a 4-year-old girl. He then took this 4-year-old girl into a nearby wooded area and he raped her. Franklin then abandoned the girl and fled the scene. And then following, the girl had a physical examination and it was found semen stains all over her body, but also bite marks around her vagina, which is just disgusting. Like, I can't even put it into words. Like, a 4-year-old girl. Franklin was thankfully caught and charged for this rape and was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. This man is disgusting. And also that is a very, very quick escalation. So far as we know anyway, Franklin has only committed petty crime, theft. I mean, I suppose he did try and steal a gun, which is obviously a little bit more serious, but it's more theft-related crimes. And now, all of a sudden, he is sexually assaulting a child. And I do think it's very significant that he went back to the orphanage that he was also sexually assaulted at. Like, I do just feel like that is significant in some kind of way. And I really wish that he had gotten longer in prison, because 10 to 20 years, that is a very big gap, is not long enough for the crime that he committed. I honestly just wish at this point they had put Franklin in prison, locked him up and thrown away the key. So it's now 1962. Franklin is in prison, but Franklin doesn't want to stay in prison. Oh no. He does everything in his power to escape. He literally, at every chance that he could, he would try to escape. And it was only 4 months into his prison sentence that he actually managed to escape. Franklin was being escorted to have an eye examination, and this is how he escaped. It's just like, seriously, like, how? I feel like I've covered so many prisoners escaping now. It's like, can we not keep a better eye on them? And as soon as Franklin escaped, he steals a car, buys a pellet pistol, and then the very next day, he tries to rob a bank. What? Really? Who the hell escapes prison and then the next day tries to rob a bank? Why the hell did he do this? Like, you're going to get caught. If you want to escape from prison, you lay low. You don't try and rob a bloody bank. And he actually manages to rob a bank. How? And he manages to escape with $7,000. However, he was caught and captured later that very same day, and he was sent back to prison, and an extra 15 years was placed on his sentence. But does that deter Franklin? Oh no, of course it doesn't, because just 2 months after he first escaped, he escaped again. So how he escaped this second time is that Franklin and a group of other prisoners managed to hotwire a truck. Again, why do they have access to a truck? And then they rammed the truck through the prison gates. But it wasn't actually very successful, thank God. They actually didn't manage to escape outside of the prison, but they did obviously give it a very good attempt. And Franklin was given an extra 5 years on top of his sentence. So Franklin is really racking up the years right now in prison, because he's now being given 20 more years on top of his original sentence, which was 10 to 20 years. So that is a minimum of 30 years in prison, isn't it? Spoiler, he doesn't actually serve all of that. So after these attempted escapes, the prison officials finally think, I think there's something that we need to do about this. So they transfer Franklin to a high security federal prison. So basically he has no chance of escaping ever again. But inside the prison that he was transferred to, because it was maximum security, there were a lot of bad people there. And one thing that we all know about prisons is that pedophiles are on the bottom of the pile, essentially. Nobody likes pedophiles in prison. No one likes pedophiles full stop, but in prison they don't have the best time. And it didn't take too long for the other prisoners to find out what Franklin did, and that was raping a 4-year-old girl. Following this, Franklin was subjected to severe violence and sexual violence as well. He was routinely raped, beaten, and tortured. And Franklin didn't get any help or protection from the guards either. Like, literally no one liked him in prison and no one wanted to help him, because the guards as well would routinely discipline and beat Franklin as well, more than the other prisoners. So Franklin decided that he was going to have to do something to make his prison life a little bit more bearable. And this is when he decided that he was going to get a daddy in prison. And of course, this came at a cost, because Franklin had to perform sexual acts on his daddy almost on a daily basis. But it also meant that Franklin now had protection because of his daddy, and therefore he was no longer beaten or raped by the other prisoners. And this is how Franklin lived his life in prison for the next 10 years. Because after 10 years, in January of 1973, Franklin was released. I told you he didn't serve all of his time, which is so frustrating. I mean, he's a sexual predator. He is a pedophile. Why is he being let out after 10 years? And he tried to escape multiple times, and he was given more time on top for those escapes, but it was almost like that time didn't mean anything, because he was just released after the minimum amount of time. And I can't believe I'm saying this, because how does it get worse than raping a child? But this case only gets worse from here, because in January of 1973, Franklin is currently 29 years old. You would think that after being released from prison, and he's obviously spent a decent amount of time in prison, hasn't he? He would want to be on his best behavior so he doesn't go back. But of course not, because Franklin is actually back in custody just 1 month later. And he ended up back in custody because 1 month later at a gas station, he slapped a woman, called her a bitch, grabbed at her clothes, and tried to kidnap her. Seriously, what is with this man? And thankfully, the woman managed to escape. I feel like we all know what Franklin was probably planning on doing. And because the woman escaped, she was able to report this to the police, and Franklin was promptly arrested. But Franklin wasn't sent back to prison like he should have been. He was actually released on bond, awaiting trial. I'm sorry, like what? Do you not think that this man could possibly be a flight risk? It's like this man is a dangerous, violent sexual predator who has a criminal record, who has tried to escape from prison multiple times. Why is he being released on bail awaiting trial? Make that make sense, because it doesn't, does it? In what world would anyone make that decision? And it turns out that this would be a huge mistake, because Franklin was a flight risk. He had no intention of going back to prison, because he was obviously going to get convicted for this crime. So in June of 1973, Franklin Delano Floyd would just completely disappear, like he dropped off the face of the earth. And I mean completely off the radar. New identity, new state, and he would not be found again for another 16 years. Let that sink in. He is now on the run, and he's on the run for 16 years. And it was during these 16 years that Franklin committed one of the worst crimes imaginable. The crimes that he commits in the next 16 years are what make this case so infamous. A crime that literally is the stuff of nightmares, what he goes on and does. And I'm not being dramatic there at all. Like I said, there's a special place waiting for him. But just before carrying out the horrific crimes, he needs a new identity. He needs to start again. And this is when he changes his name to Brandon Williams. And side note, there are a lot of name changes in this case. Franklin packs up and leaves and starts again quite a few times, and each time he gives himself a new name. But just to make things less confusing throughout this case, I am still going to call him Franklin, but I will point out when he changes his name again. But it's so confusing. You will understand there are so many name changes that it would just get so confusing, because I'm telling you, researching this case, some sources actually do refer to Franklin as his other names, and it just got so confusing for me, so I'm just going to be calling him Franklin for this video. So Franklin, who is now Brandon Williams, Williams has his new identity and he needs to find his next victim. So in 1974, approximately a year of being on the run, Franklin meets a woman. Sandy was in her mid-20s and she was currently a single mom of 4, and her 4 children were Suzanne, aged 5, Allison, aged 3, Amy, aged 2, and Philip, aged 1. Sandy had been finding it difficult over the last few years to raise her children on her own. She turned to drugs a lot of the time to cope, and she was currently working as a sex worker to pay the bills. And it was at this point that she met a man called Brandon Williams, obviously Franklin, and Franklin seemed like the perfect man. He seemed like he had everything put together. He seemed like the kind of man that was gonna save the day. Like he was gonna come in and help Sandy raise her children, provide for the family. Franklin told Sandy that he could help her turn her life around, and Sandy completely fell for Franklin. She believed him. And just 1 month after they first met, they are married. And in the beginning, Sandy thought that this was perfect. Franklin was going to be the perfect husband. Everything was going to be great, but obviously it wasn't. Sandy was about to go through something that no parent should ever have to go through, something that is completely unimaginable to any parent. And this all started when Franklin started to form a very close but creepy relationship with her oldest daughter, Suzanne. Suzanne Savakis was born on the 6th of September 1969. Now, Suzanne was a bright and brilliant child. She was a very happy girl as well. She had the warmest heart and the kindest smile, and Franklin got a little bit too close to her. He took an instant liking to her, but not in a good way at all. He would spend more time with Suzanne than the other children, and he started to get very attached to Suzanne as well. And it's thought that this was around the time that Franklin started to put a plan in place, one that would completely destroy Suzanne's life for the rest of her life. So it all started when Suzanne's mom, Sandy, went to the store one day to buy diapers for her children. Now, this is what she did all the time. She goes to the cashier, she hands them a check, but the check bounced. And because of this, she was sent to prison for 30 days. Now, that seems very extreme to me. Like, why is anyone being sent to prison for just a bounced check, especially when they're trying to buy supplies for their children? I mean, she clearly had some kind of maybe priors or something that contributed to the fact that she was sent to prison, but still, it's like, why is she being sent to prison? So Sandy does her 30 days, and when she is released, when she returns home, all of her children are gone. So initially, Sandy is probably really confused. She probably doesn't know what's going on. She probably thinks that Franklin has just taken her children out for the day. So when she tries to phone around and everything and tries to find out, like, where are my children? She soon finds out that Franklin, who is her husband, has taken all of her children. And Franklin has vanished without a trace. And as soon as she finds out this, she is phoning everyone and anyone that she can to try and track down her children, try and locate where they are. I mean, can you even imagine just the sheer panic and terror that she is going through right now? All of her children, all 4 children, are gone. She calls friends, families, the authorities, police. All the authorities could tell her was that in the 30 days that she was in prison, her husband had emptied her bank account, taken all of the children, and then abandoned the children at different children's homes around the state. And I don't know why he does this. Like, what does he get out of doing this? And I thought to myself, well, this has got to have some sort of significance to when he was abandoned at an orphanage. This is a huge parallel to his own childhood, his own mom abandoning him at an orphanage. Not that it explains it, but I just feel like that was a huge parallel to his own childhood and must have some sort of significance here. So Sandy, after finding out this, she tries to track down her 4 children. Now, she actually tracks down her 2 middle children, her 2 daughters, Amy and Allison, pretty quickly and gets them back. But her eldest, Suzanne, and the youngest, Philip, are nowhere to be found. But she has hope. She doesn't give up. She keeps looking. But tragically, it would not be a happy ending. Her youngest son, Philip, had been given up by Franklin in a private adoption, and Sandy had no way of tracking him down because it was a private adoption. And Philip's whereabouts would remain a mystery for the next 35 years. And as for her eldest daughter, Suzanne, well, her fate was much worse because Franklin hadn't abandoned Suzanne in a home because Franklin wanted to keep Suzanne for himself. And when Sandy figured this out, because obviously Sandy was witness to Franklin and his creepy relationship with Suzanne, she reported Franklin to the police. She said, listen, this man, he has my daughter Suzanne, like he has kidnapped her. And the police, all they could say in response was, well, I'm sorry, but it's technically not kidnap because he is your husband and he is legally Suzanne's stepdad, and therefore it's not kidnap. Which, I'm sorry, makes no sense at all. A parent or a legal guardian of a child can definitely 100% kidnap that child. So Suzanne was gone. She was abducted by Franklin. She was trapped by Franklin, and Sandy would never see her daughter again. Suzanne actually would never escape from Franklin. She would never escape his clutches. Suzanne was about to enter into a lifetime of abuse that makes this whole case just so unbelievably tragic and heartbreaking. So now Franklin has Suzanne. He does everything in his power to make sure that neither one of them can be tracked down. He flees from Georgia and he moves to Oklahoma City. He finds a place for himself and Suzanne, and he changes his name again. This time he goes by Trenton Davis. He got himself a job and he enrolls Suzanne into the local school system, which I could not believe that he actually let Suzanne go to school. You would think, him not wanting to get caught, he wouldn't want to enroll Suzanne into school, because obviously if Suzanne is in school, there is a paper trail, there is evidence that she has been there, etc. But he just enrolls her into a school like nothing has happened. And I can't quite help but think, what is Suzanne thinking at this point? Like, what is she aware of? She's 4 years old, but she's still going to be aware of things around her. And amazingly, Franklin made it appear to everybody else that the situation was normal. He went around telling everybody that Suzanne was his daughter and that Suzanne's mom had passed away when she was younger. And somehow he manages to keep up this facade for years. I also want to point out that Suzanne still has her real name, Suzanne, at this point. So it's really baffling how he wasn't caught. Another thing that is completely shocking about this case, because Suzanne, I can't even imagine what she was going through at the hands of Franklin. Suzanne has been torn away from her mother, from her other siblings, and now she's being forced to live in an area that she doesn't know with a man that she doesn't really know, and he is abusive, controlling. We also know he's a sexual predator. But on the surface, to everybody else, Suzanne seemed like a very happy child. She did extremely well in school. She had a lot of friends. She was very happy, very friendly. She always had the biggest smile on her face. Her teachers absolutely loved her. But that was on the surface. Behind closed doors was another story, because life for Suzanne behind closed doors was not a good one. Franklin was emotionally manipulating her. He was forcing Suzanne to repeat the narrative of that her mom had died when she was younger. But it wasn't just mental and emotional abuse that Franklin subjected Suzanne to, because he was also sexually abusing her as well. And again, a little warning here, if you don't want to know about any abuse, sexual abuse, maybe skip forward like 60 seconds. So starting straight away from the age of 4, Franklin was sexually abusing Suzanne. He was taking sexually explicit pictures of Suzanne. He would make Suzanne wear very revealing clothing and pose in very inappropriate sexual poses and take pictures of her. He would do this on a regular basis. He would actually take sexually explicit pictures of Suzanne for her whole life, and he would add these photos into his private collection where he would look at them often. But it wasn't just these photos. It is also thought that Franklin was subjecting Suzanne to various forms of sexual abuse. And this abuse wasn't just at the hands of Franklin himself, because it's thought that Franklin would allow his friends to also sexually abuse Suzanne. And to this day, the full extent of what Suzanne went through is not actually known, because there are only a few people that actually know what happened, and that is Franklin, Suzanne, and then Franklin's friends that would also participate in the sexual abuse, and none of them have either been able to or want to talk. But from the evidence of the photos of Suzanne, it can be assumed what some of the sexual abuse is, but it was horrific. Let's just put it that way. So after a few years of living in Oklahoma City and somehow managing to get away with all of this, because it's so baffling how he was able to just do all of this and no one knew. Well, after a few years, people did start to become suspicious of Franklin. And that is because people started to notice his inappropriate behavior towards Suzanne. And a babysitter of Suzanne was actually the first one to make allegations against Franklin that he could possibly be sexually abusing Suzanne. But unfortunately, these allegations never led to any justice, because as soon as Franklin found out that these allegations had been made, he got spooked and fled. He ran away again, and Franklin and Suzanne disappeared. They both have new names now. Franklin changes his name to Warren Marshall, and Suzanne has her first name change, and she is now known as Sharon Marshall. And side note, if any of you watching this are familiar with this case, Sharon Marshall is probably a familiar name to you. And that is because in a lot of sources on this case, Suzanne is actually referred to as Sharon Marshall, because Suzanne's true identity wasn't known until decades later. So for a lot of the time, for a lot of the investigation, she's actually referred to as Sharon Marshall. But I am still going to call her Suzanne because that was her birth name, and just so it doesn't get too confusing with all of the name changes. So yeah, Franklin and Suzanne. So anyway, Franklin and Suzanne are now on the run. They move from state to state. They're constantly on the move. And this goes on for about a decade, where they're on the run, essentially not really staying in one place for too long. Suzanne goes to many different schools because Franklin is still enrolling her into the local schools. And Suzanne is now entering her teenage years. This has been going on for so long, and I also want to point out that no one is looking for Suzanne. Suzanne's mom had stopped looking for her at this point, and also the authorities didn't actually know that Suzanne was missing. So no one is looking for her, which is probably one of the reasons why this went on for so long and was able to go on for so long, because no one is looking for her. So Suzanne is completely trapped. And this case really does blow my mind, because I touched on this a little bit earlier when she was obviously 4 years old, but she is now in her teenage years. How much does Suzanne know? How much does she know about her mom, about her siblings, about Franklin, about her true identity? Or is she just completely brainwashed by Franklin at this point? It's quite possible that she may even have Stockholm syndrome at this point. Is she even aware of the abuse and everything that is actually happening to her? It's really hard to even imagine what possible state of mind Suzanne is in at this point. I have so many questions when it comes to this case, but to this day, we actually don't know the answers to all of these questions. No one actually has any idea of what Suzanne's life was like on a day-to-day basis for those first 10 years or so. But eventually we get to January of 1983. Suzanne is now 13 years old. And at 13, she enrolls in Forest Park High School in Atlanta. And this is actually pretty significant because Suzanne stays at this high school until graduation. So Franklin and Suzanne are in Atlanta, Georgia for a pretty long time. So Suzanne settles into this high school. And even after years of abuse at the hands of Franklin, she still appears as this bright, happy child. She is described as outgoing, bubbly, incredibly intelligent. She was a straight A student, and it's hard to even imagine how she was able to achieve this given everything that she is going through at home. And she had big dreams for her future. She absolutely loved science, in particular physics. And she had dreams of one day working for NASA. She was determined to not let Franklin hold her back from her dreams. But no matter how much Suzanne put on a front that everything was okay, teachers and her close friends could tell that there was something going on. Something wasn't right. First of all, her family life was a complete mystery. She didn't really speak that much about her family, about her home life. There was also quite a few conflicting stories about her mom and how she passed away. Sometimes it would be a car accident, and then other times it would be cancer. Something else that people found weird as well is that Suzanne had to be home every single day at 4 p.m. No later, not even a minute later. And if she was ever running late, a minute late, people said that they could see the terror and the fear in her eyes. Now, Suzanne told everyone that she had to be back at 4 p.m. because she needed to clean the house and cook for her dad. The story was that her dad had a really bad back, like a back injury of some sort, and she needed to look after him. But obviously we know that that's not true, but that is just what Suzanne used to tell people. But also people have reported that Suzanne also said that she had to give her dad back massages. That's creepy, and people thought that it was creepy. But not only that, whenever Franklin would drop off Suzanne in the morning to school, they would kiss on the mouth. Yeah. No. Ugh. And as Suzanne moved through the years of high school, the older she got, she started to wear more and more revealing clothing. And people could tell that Suzanne didn't want to wear these clothes. She definitely seemed very uncomfortable in these clothes. And people said that it was almost like somebody else was choosing her outfits. Ugh. And I wonder who that was. And even though friends and teachers could see all of these warning signs, all of these red flags, there was never enough evidence to actually do anything about this, which is just incredibly infuriating. Whenever Suzanne was asked about any of this strange, creepy behavior, she would just clam up in fear and refuse to talk. Suzanne lived in total and utter fear of Franklin her whole life. He controlled her and brainwashed her and abused and manipulated her. And this was all by a man that Suzanne was forced into calling her father. And there was a pretty significant thing that happened to Suzanne in high school, and that is that she got a best friend. She was actually in a location long enough to get a true best friend. And this was a girl called Jennifer Fisher. Now, they first met during summer camp. They didn't actually go to the same high school, and they quickly became inseparable. They would talk on the phone for hours. They would spend so much time together every moment that they could. And then one day, Suzanne invited Jennifer over for a sleepover. And as we can probably not really imagine, but try and imagine, a sleepover at Franklin Floyd's house is not a sleepover that anyone would want to go to. Jennifer was definitely not prepared for the experience that she was about to have. So Jennifer arrived at Suzanne's house. She was introduced to Franklin, and straight away she could tell that something wasn't right with that man. She just got this really weird feeling about Franklin. And then Franklin says to the two girls, "Oh, we should all go clubbing tonight." And both girls are 14 at this point, I just want to point out. And Franklin wanted them to go to a club. And this is not a club that is for like teenagers. Oh no, this is like a proper adult over 18 kind of club. And Jennifer was incredibly uncomfortable with this. She had never gone to an over 18s club before. She didn't really want to, but she was also in a position where she couldn't exactly say no. But she was trying to get out of it. She was saying, "Oh, I don't really have anything to wear. Like, I don't know about this." And then Franklin says to Jennifer, "Oh, I'm sure we can find something for you to wear." He then takes Jennifer up to Suzanne's bedroom, and Franklin is there trying to pick an outfit out for Jennifer. And he's saying things like, "Oh, we can put Jennifer into that pink and black dress." Franklin is there and he's picking their outfits and they're getting dressed. And if that doesn't send a shiver down your spine, I don't know what will. And then when the two girls are completely dressed, Franklin says to both of them, Oh, you are both something to see. No, that just makes me, ugh, no. He literally makes me physically sick. But not only that, when Jennifer was getting dressed, she started to notice all of the very inappropriate clothing that Suzanne had. Now, bear in mind that Suzanne is 14, and the kind of things that she had in her wardrobe are not what you find in a 14-year-old's wardrobe. She had very sexy lingerie. She had crotchless panties, very revealing bikinis. It's like, no. And Suzanne says to Jennifer that her dad lets her have this stuff and that he even buys it for her. But anyway, Franklin takes them to a club. He talks to the bouncer to let them in, and then he just leaves them there alone. And this club is full of creepy men. Maybe not as creepy as Franklin, but they are still very creepy. And all of these creepy men that maybe even Franklin knows. You never know, because we all know that Franklin allows his friends to also sexually abuse Suzanne, so who knows. But all of these creepy men are looking very inappropriately at Jennifer and Suzanne. They're dancing with them, saying very inappropriate things to them, and Suzanne is used to all of this. She is in the club and she's dancing away with all of these creepy men. She actually looks at home dancing with these creepy men, which again is so sick when you think about it, because she's used to this. But Jennifer is terrified at all of these creepy older men approaching her and saying all of these very sexually suggestive things. I can imagine she is completely traumatized by this experience. And thankfully, in the end, at the end of the night, both girls leave the club unharmed, physically anyway. So they head back to Franklin's house, but there is one more event that happens on this night. So when they are back at the house, Suzanne and Jennifer are winding down from the clubbing and talking about like what happened. They're getting ready for bed, etc. When Franklin bursts into the room and points a gun directly at Jennifer. He starts shouting, "I thought I told you girls to go to bed." He looks furious, and Jennifer is absolutely terrified. She literally feels like she's going to pass out. She's going into full-blown panic mode. And then all of a sudden, Franklin bursts out laughing. This is all one joke to him. It's like he just did that to get a kick out of scaring Jennifer, which I think he did. Suzanne looked really embarrassed and she did apologize to Jennifer. She said, "I'm really sorry. This is just something that he does sometimes." I also forgot to point out that when he burst into the room, Jennifer was actually getting changed. So again, I don't know if he did it intentionally at that moment as well to see Jennifer half naked. It probably was a mixture of him wanting to see Jennifer half naked, but then also see the fear in her eyes, because people have later testified that Franklin could only ever get aroused when violence was involved. So he definitely likes power and control and making people scared. He loves that fear in people. And after that very first sleepover, Jennifer never went for another sleepover at Suzanne's house, which I think was an incredibly wise decision on her part. After all of this came out years and years later, the FBI actually came to the conclusion, based on evidence that they had, that Franklin was actually also planning to abduct Jennifer. Apparently, Franklin had taken a liking to Jennifer from this sleepover, and also Franklin on numerous occasions encouraged Suzanne to invite Jennifer over to their house again, but Jennifer obviously never went, and thankfully she was never harmed by Franklin. But it's just really creepy to know what his intentions were behind that sleepover. And then your mind starts going through everything and overanalyzing everything about what his plans possibly could have been. Like when he dropped Suzanne and Jennifer off at the club and all of those creepy men, were they Franklin's friends because they were dancing with Suzanne like they knew her? Were his friends almost scoping out Jennifer, seeing if they liked Jennifer? I'm sorry, this is just my brain going into overdrive. This is what happens, which none of this is probably true, but this is how my brain works. And even though we still don't know to this day the full extent of what Suzanne went through, this sleepover and what Jennifer went through and what Jennifer witnessed gives us a small insight into what Suzanne's life possibly was like on a daily basis. How many times did Suzanne go to that club? How many times was she in environments like that because she seemed so comfortable. So after that crazy sleepover, Jennifer returns home and the two girls, their lives go back to normal. They stay incredibly close to one another. That sleepover didn't end their friendship. They would still speak on the phone all the time. Suzanne would actually go over to Jennifer's house a lot as well. She would have lots of sleepovers at Jennifer's house. Suzanne was actually really close with Jennifer's parents. She spent a lot of time at that house, which again, I think portrays how much control Franklin has over Suzanne, because Franklin lets Suzanne have quite a lot of freedom, really, doesn't he? When we've done these cases before about abduction and kidnap and things like that, a lot of the time the abuser, the kidnapper, doesn't allow their victim to have much freedom. But this case is completely different. But that really does just show how much control Franklin has over Suzanne, that he can trust that she can go to school, have friends, sleep over at other people's houses, and she's not going to say a single word. And the years go by. Suzanne is seemingly normal on the surface, but she is living anything but a normal life. And then we get to 1986, and this is the year that Suzanne is going to graduate. So remember how smart Suzanne was. She still had dreams of one day working for NASA, and she actually managed to get a full scholarship to Georgia Tech, which was literally the college of her dreams, and this was her way out of Franklin as well. But this was everything that she ever wanted, and she got a full scholarship. She was over the moon. She couldn't believe that her dreams were now a possibility. But when she told Franklin about the scholarship, he was not happy. He said that she wasn't allowed to go and that she had to stay with him. Suzanne was obviously devastated, but she didn't lose hope. She thought that maybe she could convince Franklin to let her go. But then something else happened that would actually crush her dreams, and that is that she fell pregnant. Now, why I say that her falling pregnant would completely crush her dreams is that when Georgia Tech found out that Suzanne was pregnant, they rescinded the scholarship. They said that they couldn't give her the scholarship if she was pregnant. Now, I don't really understand that. I don't think that that is right, obviously, but that was what their decision was. We also have to remember that it is 1986, which is not that long ago, but it was obviously still a different time. And when Suzanne was asked who the father was, no one knew who the father was. Suzanne would always say that it was another boy in her school, but we don't actually know, and there were whispers that Franklin was the father. So Suzanne gave birth to this baby, and Franklin immediately made her give this baby up for adoption. He did a private adoption again and apparently made quite a bit of money. And then after this, Suzanne did graduate from high school, and then Suzanne and Franklin packed up their things again and moved again to a new location. And this is just absolutely heartbreaking because Suzanne had everything that she'd ever wanted. She had this full scholarship. She had this full ride to Georgia Tech. She had her dreams literally in the palm of her hands. And I don't actually think it's ever been proven who the father of that baby was. But I personally think that it was Franklin. And I think Franklin intentionally got Suzanne pregnant because he knew that the scholarship would be rescinded if she was pregnant. But that is just my theory. I didn't see that anywhere. That is just my theory. I think Franklin is very capable of that. And then after he makes her give up her baby, crushes her college dreams, he makes her pack up her things and move to a new location. Now, when they were in Atlanta, Georgia, they were there for a significant amount of time. And Suzanne spent most of her teenage years in Atlanta as well. And your teenage years are where you are going from a child to an adult. It's when you are forming your personality and your views on the world and what you believe in. These are very important years. And she had also formed some very close bonds with people. And she was just torn away from all of that. And she would never see her friends again. She would never see Jennifer again. So like before, they move around here and there. They never really stay in one place for too long. Suzanne works a few odd jobs, and this goes on for 2 years that they're just kind of like drifting around before they settle in Tampa, Florida. And then once they were in Tampa, Florida, Suzanne had to start her whole life again. And it's crazy how many times this actually happened. So it is now 1988 and Suzanne is now 18 years old. I can't believe that she is an adult. This has been going on for so long. And when she is 18, Suzanne falls pregnant again. But this time she's allowed to keep the baby. So Suzanne gives birth to a boy and she calls him Michael. And this time Franklin is definitely not the dad. The dad is actually a young man called Greg Higgs. However, even though Greg was Michael's biological father, he was not allowed to be involved in anything with Michael's life. And the baby would be raised by Franklin, as if Franklin was the dad. And again, I think this is just another example of how much control Franklin has over Suzanne, that he allows her to date other people and he still knows that she is going to stay loyal to him. Obviously, that loyalty is out of fear, but still. And over the next couple of years, Suzanne grows incredibly close to Michael. I mean, of course she does, that's her son. But I feel like Suzanne had a particularly strong bond with Michael because prior to Michael, she didn't really have much to live for. Franklin pretty much stripped her of everything. But now she has Michael. She now has a purpose in life. But unfortunately, the story of Michael would end in complete tragedy. Eventually, Michael would also be dragged into Franklin's path of destruction. There is still so much heartbreak to come in this case. It's just crazy how much happens in this case, but we still have so much to go through in Suzanne's story first. So now we get to another very significant part of this case. And it all begins when Suzanne starts working at a local strip club. And Suzanne was forced into working at a strip club. She didn't want to work there. I mean, obviously we know that she had dreams of working for NASA, but as soon as she turned 18, Franklin made her get a job at a strip club. And she was working at a local club in Tampa called Mons Venus. And even though she didn't want to be there, she made the best of the situation and she made a lot of friends at the strip club. She was friends with all of the other dancers, and still, like school, on the surface, she appeared very happy, very put together, bright, bubbly, outgoing. People at the club saw her as a really strong, caring mother. They had no idea what was going on behind closed doors. And it really is amazing, and it really does tell you exactly the kind of person that Suzanne was, that she was able to be strong enough to go through all of this trauma but still be a good person. That shows a lot of strength in her character. So when she was working at the club, a series of very strange events happened, and this completely freaked out the other dancers at the club. And it was this strange series of events that started to alert the other people at the club that Suzanne may not have it as good as it seems. Because the first thing is that Suzanne's dad, Franklin, but everyone at the club thought that Franklin was her dad. Suzanne's dad would accompany her to the strip club. He would drop her off, but then he would also come in to the strip club and watch his daughter. He would sit there and watch his daughter dance topless. This freaked everybody out, understandably so. But then that's not it. Oh no, because Franklin would also make comments about his daughter's body to the other customers. He would say things like, oh, do you not think her boobs are too small? Do you not think she should get a boob job? I mean, we all know that Franklin is creepy, okay? So these comments don't come as a surprise to me. But what does surprise me is that Franklin is doing all of this out in the open. We need to remember here that he is a federal fugitive. He's also kidnapped Suzanne and held her for 14 years. Surely he should be laying low, not drawing too much attention to himself, not making these extremely creepy comments about his supposed daughter in a club to strangers. And then eventually Franklin did force Suzanne into getting a boob job. And then after she got her boob job, he would then still go into the strip club and watch her dance. But then he would also make comments like, oh, look at her boobs. They look so much better now. It's like, oh God, it just makes you sick, doesn't it? But it gets worse. It does. So Franklin soon wasn't happy with just the money that she was making from the strip club. I probably should have said this, but he didn't work, by the way. Suzanne had to provide for both of them from the money that she made from the club. So he then forced her into sex work to make more money. So one of the other dancers at the club, a girl named Heather, used to host private parties, and Franklin starts talking to Heather and asks her if his daughter can get involved in these private parties. It is really sick, isn't it, that he's posing as her dad and saying all of this. What is Heather thinking? What is everybody else thinking? So Suzanne gets involved in these private parties, and Franklin would drive Suzanne and Heather to these private parties. He would drop off his daughter. He is literally pimping her out, but he has been doing that for most of her life with his friends, so I'm not really surprised. But it gets even weirder. So he would normally just drop Suzanne and Heather off and wait in the car outside. But then one time he said to Heather, "Is it okay if I come in and watch?" Heather was freaked out because she was like, hang on a minute, you want to come in and watch your daughter have sex with strangers? Of course, Heather said no. But Franklin wanted to go in and take pictures of his daughter. And then it just gets even creepier because there was one time where Franklin arranged for Heather and Suzanne to carry out sex work for one of his friends. And Heather was just like, what the hell? Why is your dad arranging for you to have sex with his friend? And Heather was not prepared at all for Suzanne's response, because Suzanne responded, "Oh, don't worry, it's no big deal. He's a lifelong friend of my dad's, and I've been having sex with him most of my life." And it was at this moment, but to be honest, it was probably before this moment, but this was the breaking point for Heather, because she was like, no, this is enough. This is weird. This is abuse. What the hell is going on here? And it turns out that Heather knew exactly what Suzanne was going through, because she had actually had a very similar experience herself. Because when she was only 9 years old, she was kidnapped by a convicted rapist and held for 5 years. That in itself is a crazy story that I don't have time to get into. What are the chances that that has happened to Heather, and what is happening to Suzanne? So Heather finally started to see the signs of abuse, of sexual abuse that Suzanne was going through. Heather was in a very unique situation that she could understand what Suzanne was going through. So Heather approaches Suzanne and she says, "You need to get away from him. You need to wake up. You need to see what's happening. You need to save yourself, save your son." But Suzanne breaks down into tears. This was probably the one and only time that Suzanne was actually herself. And she said, "I can't leave him. I can't. He's threatened to kill me and my son if I ever do." And Suzanne asked Heather to not tell anyone what was happening. Suzanne was truly scared of Franklin. So Heather accepted Suzanne's wishes. She could see how terrified Suzanne was, and she promised not to tell anyone. But Franklin is about to find himself a new victim. The story is truly never ending. And this was a woman called Cheryl Ann Comesso. She was about to get sucked into the monstrous world of Franklin, and very tragically, she was not going to make it out alive. Cheryl Ann Comesso was 19 years old, and she was also working at the Mons Venus strip club in Tampa, Florida. And obviously, this is how she knew Suzanne. And Cheryl was a very kind, very friendly, very caring woman, and she had hopes and dreams of one day becoming an actress in Hollywood. And when she was working at the strip club in Tampa, this is when she had the unfortunate experience of meeting Franklin Floyd. So one day, Franklin goes up to Cheryl, knowing that she wants to be an actress in Hollywood, and he tells her that he has connections in the film industry and he can get her a role in a film. And Cheryl is like, "Oh my God, that is amazing, sign me up." So Cheryl goes along with Franklin to this shoot, but it was not exactly the film that she had in mind. I think Cheryl thought that it was just going to be like a regular film, but when she got to the shoot, Franklin told her that she was going to have to perform sexual acts with another woman on a beach, and that the other woman that she was going to have to do the shoot with was his own daughter, Suzanne. And Cheryl was like, "Oh no way, I'm not doing that. That is just too weird." But Franklin told her that if she actually wanted to break Hollywood, this is what she was going to have to do. And after he lied and manipulated Cheryl, she did end up agreeing to participate. So she took part in the film, and it was definitely weird. It was uncomfortable, but she got through it. And then at some point after the shoot, I don't think it was on the same day, but Franklin also attempted attempted to rape Cheryl. He cornered her and tried to assault her. Thankfully, he didn't. Cheryl actually got away. But it's quite clear, isn't it, to all of us, that that film was just for his own satisfaction, his own gratification. And Cheryl also realized that as well. And she realized that the whole Hollywood story was complete BS. He didn't have any connections. And Cheryl wanted revenge. And she wanted to punish Franklin in the only way she knew that would work, the only thing that would actually have an impact on him, and that was through his money. Cheryl knew that Franklin was claiming benefits fraudulently, so she reported him. And because she reported him, his benefits got taken away. Franklin was furious. So he stormed over to Cheryl in the club the next time he saw her, and he said to her, "How dare you do this? You're going to pay for this. You'll regret this." And then just 1 week later, after this outburst, Cheryl went missing. Franklin had murdered Cheryl in the most brutal, horrific, and sexually violent way, but no one would actually know that he did this until many years later. So Franklin has just murdered for the first time. He had always threatened Suzanne with it. He had always told Suzanne that he was capable of it. It's also thought that Suzanne witnessed Cheryl's murder, and he probably did this intentionally so he would scare Suzanne even more so she would never try to escape. And the worst thing about all of this is that he got away with it. No one found out. I mean, obviously they did years later, but at the time he got away with it. So after this murder, Franklin decides that they both need to go on the run again. He tells Suzanne that they are leaving town. She obviously has no choice in all of this. They both assume new identities again. They both change their names. So Franklin is now going by the name Clarence Hughes and Suzanne is going by the name Tonya Hughes. And Franklin in this next move decides that he no longer wants to be father and daughter. Oh, no. He wants to be husband and wife. And I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but it's like this man truly disgusts me. And Franklin actually managed to get a legitimate marriage license. They had a marriage certificate and everything. I don't know if they had a ceremony. I'm not sure about that. But there are so many things in this case where I ask myself the same question. How does he always get away with this? How is he getting away with it? It has been 15 years since he first kidnapped Suzanne. You've also got to remember that he's still a federal fugitive. He is on the run. And now he's made Suzanne his wife legally. It's like, how is he doing this? How is he getting away with this? This case is just too much. It just is. And they carry on living their lives as a family of 3. And Suzanne is around 20 years old at this point. And Suzanne, as always, is just trying to make the best out of this situation. She's trying to be a good mom to Michael. And then a lot more happens. So Suzanne falls pregnant again. The dad in this pregnancy again is unknown. We don't know. It obviously stands a very good chance that it is Franklin. But once again, she is forced to give up this baby. Franklin arranges a private adoption and makes $7,000. Suzanne gets another job in another strip club, and again, very similar story to the last strip club. She is very friendly, bubbly, outgoing. She makes friends with all of the other dancers. Everyone loves her. And it was at this point where Suzanne enters into a secret relationship with one of the customers at the strip club, a man named Kevin. Now, at this point, we do know that Franklin was regularly beating Suzanne. And I mean regularly. It was almost every night, and he would often beat her up because she didn't earn enough money. If she didn't bring home more than $200 a night, she would get beaten up. And it got to the point that Suzanne was just like, I can't take this anymore. I need to get out. And she confided to Kevin about this, and Kevin, of course, was completely on board. Kevin was all ready to run away with Suzanne, look after her and Michael, be a dad to Michael. And I really wish I could tell you that that happened. I really wish that I could say that Suzanne managed to escape. She managed to start a new life with Kevin. Michael finally has a stable home life, loving parents. I wish that is how this case ends, but it's not, because Franklin found out about her secret relationship. He probably even found out about her plans, and he decided to punish her in the worst way possible. Because just a few days later, Suzanne was walking down the road and she tragically got hit by a car and she suffered some really serious injuries that landed her in hospital and she was in a coma. The driver of the car was never found and the police put it down to a hit and run. But I think we all know that that was no accident. Although it has never been proven, I think it's safe to say that the driver of that car was Franklin Delano Floyd. Franklin then comes into the hospital to visit Suzanne and he says, "Hi, I'm Clarence. I'm Tanya's husband." Obviously, remember they're using their fake names. And the doctors are like, "Oh, hi, Mr. Hughes, your wife is in here. She's in a really bad state right now, but she is stable and we can save her." But almost immediately after the doctors and the nurses met Franklin, they knew that something was wrong because Franklin didn't seem to care about his wife. He didn't really seem to care about her welfare, and he didn't seem overly happy about the fact that they could save her. He actually told the hospital staff that he was selling all of his and his wife's belongings and he was going to move state with his son Michael. Not really caring about his wife in a coma, he was just going to get up and leave. And then not too long after this visit, the hospital staff received a phone call from Suzanne's friends at the club, and they said, "Please, under no circumstances, allow Tanya's husband to visit her. We think he's trying to kill her." And her friends at the club tried to do everything in their power to stop Franklin from visiting Suzanne. They told the hospital, they contacted the police, but there was no evidence against Franklin, so there was nothing that anyone could do. And then tragically, it was all too late. One morning, when the nurses went into Suzanne's room, just doing like the regular things, going around doing the checks, they found Suzanne dead in her hospital bed. She had tragically passed away, and no one could understand how. She was doing perfectly fine in the grand scheme of things. She was going to recover. One minute she's on the mend, and the next minute she's passed away. No one at the hospital could make sense of any of this. All they knew is that the night before she passed away, she had been visited by Franklin and they were left in the room alone. And although it has never been proven, even to this day, but it is thought that when Franklin visited Suzanne, he murdered her. He murdered the girl that he kidnapped 16 years ago. And Suzanne Savakis was only 20 years old when he murdered her. She was only 4 years old when he first kidnapped her. For her whole life, she knew nothing but Franklin. And I just wish that Suzanne's story ended differently. I wish that she got her happy ending. I think it's quite clear why Franklin murdered Suzanne. For Suzanne's whole life, Franklin had complete control over her. I've mentioned that throughout the case. It's crazy how much control he has over her, etc. But now, at 20 years old, she now has other priorities. She has a son, Michael, that she wants to look after, care for, do anything for. She also started a relationship with another man that she cared deeply for. She could see a future with this man and a future with her son. And Franklin could see that his control was slipping and he couldn't allow that. I think Franklin did see Suzanne as his property, and I think he did have the mentality of, if I can't have her, no one can. So that is probably one of the reasons why he murdered her. But also, and probably the biggest reason, was self-preservation. If Suzanne had the courage to leave him, she may have the courage to report him. And that should be the end of this video, but it is not. I'm really sorry, but there is more heartbreak to come. Suzanne has now left behind her 2-year-old son, Michael. And now we get onto the story of Michael, which is another completely unbelievably tragic story. It was really hard to emphasize throughout the story because there was just so much going on, but Suzanne was extremely close to Michael. Michael was her whole world. And tragically, Michael would become another victim of Franklin. So after Suzanne's murder, Franklin was making plans to go on the run again. He needed to pack up and move, and he was planning on going on the run with Michael. But to go on the run, he needed money, and he was going to claim on the 2 life insurance policies that Franklin had taken out on Suzanne's life just prior to her murder. Now, if that doesn't tell you that he murdered her, I don't know what will. But when he went to claim the insurance money, he said the wrong social security number. He gave his social security number for his real identity Franklin Delano Floyd. And obviously, as soon as he gave this, that flagged something up in the system, because I feel like I need to emphasize again, he is a fugitive and he has been on the run at this point for 17 years. I feel like it's quite easy to forget that he was able to commit all of this crime whilst being on the run. And because he had messed up, the authorities were able to track him down, and Franklin was finally arrested. You're probably thinking, great, great karma at last. But no. At this point, the authorities didn't have a clue about any of the other crimes that Franklin had done. Right now, all the authorities know is that Franklin is a fugitive that skipped bail 17 years ago after the attempted kidnap of that woman at the gas station, which seems so long ago, doesn't it? Like, I wouldn't be surprised if you've forgotten about that woman. Because of this, Franklin was only charged with the attempted kidnap of that woman and skipping bail. And he was only given a 33-month sentence. It's just absolutely crazy how much luck this man has, because he was going to be out of prison in less than 3 years. And because of this, another complete tragedy is about to happen. So because Franklin gets sent to prison, Michael ends up in the care system. And he does eventually get adopted by a couple called Ernest and Merle Bean. And Michael was 2 years old when he was adopted. And it was quite clear to Ernest and Merle that Michael had developmental issues. Even though he was 2 years old, he wasn't developed the way a 2-year-old should have been. He was more along the lines of a 9-month-old. Michael would cry for hours and hours on end. He was a very anxious, scared child. Michael would also rock back and forth a lot and bang his head repeatedly against walls. And he also struggled to hold his head up properly. He also had an extreme phobia of small spaces, because it's thought that Franklin would shut him in small spaces as punishment. Michael also couldn't speak a single word at 2 years old. So Ernest and Merle clearly had a lot on their hands, but they were amazing parents. Full credit to them, because Michael was able to turn his life around. Over the next 3 years, they loved him, they nurtured him, they were very patient with him, and eventually they managed to undo all of the damage that Franklin had done. Michael had just started to attend school, and he was a bright, happy, cheerful child, and he was at the same developmental stage as his peers. Ernest and Merle had done an absolutely incredible job with Michael, and they were a tight-knit family. Michael had so much love for his new adoptive parents. And I know I've said this a lot in this video already, but I wish that this was Michael's ending. I wish that this was his happy ending. He had finally found a loving, stable family. But Franklin was soon to be released from prison, and Franklin was not going to let that be Michael's happy ending. So whilst in prison, Franklin had been trying to fight for custody of Michael, even though it had been proven that Franklin wasn't Michael's biological dad, and he made multiple legal claims, but they all failed. But once Franklin got out of prison, he decided to take matters into his own hands. On the 12th of September 1994, Michael, who is currently 5 years old, woke up and he thought that it was just going to be any normal day. He had breakfast with his parents and then he went to school. But unfortunately, this would be no ordinary day, because Franklin had snuck into Michael's school. He then held the principal at gunpoint and threatened to kill him unless he snuck Michael out of the school for him. So at the time, the principal thought that the best thing to do was to get Michael from his classroom and sneak him out of the school, a decision that to this day the principal regrets. So the principal was able to get Michael out of his classroom and sneak him out of the school. Franklin then forced Michael and the principal into his car at gunpoint, and Franklin drove off with both of them in the back of his vehicle. After driving a short time, Franklin pulled over and dragged the principal out of the car and tied him to a tree. And then Franklin drove off with Michael. Now, if you're thinking that Franklin has kidnapped Michael to raise Michael as his own son, then you would be wrong. Tragically, Michael would never be seen again. That school day was the last time that anyone would see Michael alive. And it's not exactly known, but it's thought that Franklin now murders his 5-year-old son, Michael. Another life that Franklin has just completely destroyed, taken away. This is an innocent 5-year-old child. Why couldn't Franklin just let Michael live his life with his new parents? This 5-year-old boy posed no threat to Franklin. Michael probably doesn't even remember Franklin. The last time Michael would have seen Franklin, Michael was only 2 years old. Michael would never be able to identify Franklin. Michael would never be able to report Franklin to the authorities. There is no way that Michael would ever cause Franklin to be caught. So your guess is as good as mine as to why he killed Michael. Now, I have a few theories myself. There is revenge, obviously. Revenge against Suzanne because he knew that Michael was her whole world. Again, he could also have thought that Michael was his property and had the mindset, well, if I can't have him, no one can. But to make this situation even worse is that the fate of Michael has never been discovered. He went missing and has been presumed dead. The body of Michael has never been found. And I can't even imagine the heartbreak of Michael's adoptive parents, Ernest and Merle. They have never to this day known what happened to their son. And this is why I say that there is a special place reserved for Franklin. So then you might be thinking, okay, so what happens to Franklin now? After he's murdered Michael, what happens? Are we ever going to see justice in this case? And thankfully, the answer to that question is yes. We are going to finally see some justice. Because as soon as Michael went missing, an arrest warrant was put out for Franklin Floyd because everybody knew that he had done it. The principal was also found and was able to identify him as well. And thankfully, it doesn't take them too long to track down Franklin. They arrest him, but Michael was not with him. Michael was nowhere to be found. And when the police take Franklin in for questioning, he does not say anything. He does not confess to anything. He never says anything about Michael, what happened to Michael. And this is when the FBI got involved because the FBI wanted to find Michael. They wanted to find him alive and they were going to be the best ones for the job. And the FBI tear through Franklin's life. They turn over every single stone. And this is when the truth of what Franklin has actually done starts to get revealed. Because first of all, the FBI start looking into Michael's mom, a woman that they think is called Tonya Hughes. And all the FBI can see is that Tonya Hughes passed away a few years ago from a car accident. But then they soon realize that Tonya is not actually her real name. They think that her real name is Sharon Marshall. And the FBI are thinking, why does this woman have a fake name? So then the FBI started looking into Sharon Marshall. And this is when the FBI discovered the most infamous picture from this case. And this picture depicts Franklin with a young girl sat on his lap. And the FBI see this photo, they see a picture of Sharon Marshall, and the FBI are like, hang on a minute, this is the same girl. And this is when the penny finally drops. The FBI put 2 and 2 together and realized that Franklin had kidnapped this girl decades ago and groomed her into his wife. And the FBI are just like, what the hell? They have never come across anything like this before, but the revelations get worse. Because next the FBI find Franklin's personal collection of photos. And these photos, as we know, are of Suzanne from a very young age, from the age of 4, in sexually suggestive poses and clothing. But that wasn't the only thing that the FBI found in that collection of photos, because they found another woman that was photoed. And this woman, they could tell from the photos, had been murdered in a very sexually violent way. And this woman was Cheryl Ann Comesso, the woman that Franklin had murdered approximately 5 years ago. So finally, the FBI was slowly putting together the story of Franklin Floyd and exactly what he had done over all of these years. First of all, they charged him with the kidnap of Michael and he was sentenced to 52 years. But there was also a second charge, and that was for the murder of Cheryl. And thankfully, because of the photos that the FBI had discovered, that was enough evidence and Franklin was found guilty. And this time he was sentenced to death. So finally, we have a little bit of justice in this case. But the case wasn't over yet because there were still two main questions that the FBI had. Where was Michael? But what was the true identity of the girl that Franklin had kidnapped? And Franklin was no help. He did not give the FBI any information. He kept that all to himself because that is what he got off on. He probably had a field day thinking about the FBI running around trying to figure out what he had done. And it would take the FBI nearly 2 decades to find the answers to those questions. I know, so many things in this case are mind-blowing. So in 2014, 20 years after the kidnapping of Michael, Franklin Floyd makes a full confession. He finally tells them about the girl that he kidnapped and her true identity. And this is when the FBI finally learn that that girl is Suzanne Savakis. This is also when Franklin tells the FBI that he did murder Michael. And the FBI were very skeptical about Franklin and his confessions. Obviously, the confessions about Suzanne proved to be true, but the FBI were really confused. Why was Franklin all of a sudden confessing to all of this? It just didn't make sense. And Franklin often did this. He often confessed to things that weren't true just to send the FBI into the wrong direction. So everything that Franklin said, the FBI obviously investigated, but they also had to take everything with a grain of salt. So even though Franklin confessed to the murder of Michael still hasn't been found. A body still hasn't been found. The FBI were soon able to track down Suzanne's birth mother, Sandy, almost 40 years after she was initially kidnapped. Sandy went through 40 years of not knowing where her daughter was. And as for Michael, the FBI did continue to look for Michael for quite a few years. And after years of searching, the FBI have now closed Michael's case and he is presumed dead. And this is just absolutely heartbreaking that Michael has never been found. I mean, I feel like we all know that Franklin did murder Michael. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, but there is no closure to Michael. But then there have been some other revelations that have come later on in this case. One of them being Suzanne's third child, who she was made to give up for adoption. She came forward and revealed her identity, and she is a woman called Megan, and she is an incredible woman. She came forward to pay respects to her birth mother, and Megan has had a son who she has called Michael in honor of the brother that she never met. And then in 2020, just 2 years ago, it really does feel like this case is never ending. The fourth child of Sandy was found. If you remember way back at the beginning of the story when Franklin kidnapped Sandy's 4 children, 2 of them were never found. Suzanne was obviously one of them, but then the youngest child, Philip, was also never found. But then he was found through DNA in 2020. And after all of the media coverage, Philip's adoptive parents came forward because they suspected that they were the people that adopted Philip from Franklin. So the case of Philip has now also been solved. And finally, Franklin is still alive. He is currently 79 years old and he remains on death row in Florida. And that was the case of Franklin Delano Floyd. And if you are still here at the end of this video, whew, that was intense. That was a lot. That is an understatement. This was definitely the hardest case I have ever had to research. Probably the most confusing and complex cases I have ever researched, but also one of the most heartbreaking. The crimes that Franklin committed are truly unthinkable. When you take a step back and actually look at what has happened and what Franklin has done, it's hard to wrap your head around it. Let me just get this straight. Franklin Delano Floyd, over the space of 20 years, and I'm only going to talk about 20 years because he did a lot before those 20 years as well, was able to go on the run from the government, change his identity multiple times, kidnap 4-year-old Suzanne, raise her as his own, whilst also mentally, physically, and sexually abusing her, then groomed Suzanne into becoming his wife, raised a son with her, is then suspected of murdering Suzanne, then murdered one of Suzanne's colleagues, went to prison, got out of prison, then kidnapped Michael, then murdered Michael, and no one ever caught him until obviously the very end. And then, after he was caught, it took another 20 years to figure out exactly what happened. And still to this day, not everything has been figured out. We still, to this day, don't know what happened to Michael. And I really tried my best to do this case justice, but there is so much more that happens in this story. I was just unable to include absolutely everything, because truly, if I had included everything, we would be here for days. So there is even more things that happened. I obviously covered the main things that happened, but there is even more that happened. And there are some great books out there on this case that I read and listened to. And I will leave the links to those books in my description box, so if you want even more context on this case, go check out those books. But there are no words for Franklin Floyd, are they? He is definitely one of the most despicable people I think we've covered, and his crimes, in terms of the emotional impact that they would have had, are definitely some of the worst. And of course, we now need to pay tribute to the many victims of this story. Cheryl Ann Comesso was described as a bright and confident young girl. She was intelligent, outgoing, and had dreams of becoming a Hollywood star. These innocent dreams were crushed by Franklin, and she was taken far too soon when she was only 19 years old. Michael Anthony Hughes had grown up to be a happy and outgoing, bright young boy. He had endured so much trauma in his younger years, but he had finally found parents that loved and cared for him and could give him the support that he truly needed. He was finally happy. He was finally in a stable household. He had such a bright, happy future ahead of him. Michael had his whole life ahead of him, but Franklin didn't want him to have a happy life, a happy future. And Franklin took Michael away when he was only 5 years old. And finally, Suzanne Savakis started life as a beautiful and bright young child. With blonde hair and sparkling blue eyes, a sweet smile, and the warmest heart. She suffered through so much trauma. She was extremely intelligent, caring, friendly, willing to help anyone. She had hopes and dreams. She was absolutely loved and adored by everyone around her. She thought that she had the chance to escape the nightmare that Franklin had put her through, but he took that chance away from her. The full tragedy of Suzanne's life would take decades to be revealed, but when it did, Suzanne was finally able to be laid under her true identity. And it's very easy to forget how young Suzanne also was when she was murdered by Franklin, because she was only 20 years old. So today we're doing Mick Philpott, and I have wanted to do this case ever since I started true crime on my channel. And let me just warn you right now, Sassy Danielle is going to be coming out in this video. For those of you watching in the UK, I'm sure you know who Mick Philpott is, and there's a good chance that you may know him if you're not from the UK, because he's pretty infamous, because he's a pretty terrible person.
Look, the scum, the stranded, the shameless Mick. What? All of you.
Who would want somebody like you, for Christ's sake?
What he says goes. What he wanted, he had.
I say you're born with a dick between your legs, not just to pee out of, so I'm going to use it.
And this man is the worst. He is evil. He is narcissistic. He is a predator. And he thought that he could do whatever he wanted and get away with it. Mick had a huge ego. But what's new with all of the people that we cover on this channel, he had a huge ego, but he also was kind of this wannabe celebrity. It was kind of weird.
Today I want to discover the man behind the headlines and uncover the truth about the guy who has been branded Britain's biggest scrounger.
And he ended up on TV for all of the wrong reasons, but Mick didn't care about this. He just cared about getting attention.
So you're going to criticise my family, pal, and my kids. I'll criticise you as much as I want.
Sorry,
this is a free country.
Why do we give people like this a platform? Like, why do we put them on TV? However, unfortunately, Mick and his ego had a very, very dark side. And I'm going to say right now that half of the things that I'm going to be talking about in this case, I wasn't aware of until I did the research. And I thought I knew this case pretty well because this case led to an absolute terrible tragedy that was huge in the media. It was making headlines on a daily basis. It was a media circus around this case. So yeah, Mick Philpott, not a good person. And if you know who he is, he's worse than you thought. So we've got a lot to get through in today's case. Okay, so Mick Philpott was born in 1956. And that is all I know. I don't know what month and I don't know the day. So I cannot tell you his zodiac sign, which is just really annoying. And Mick grew up in Derby, which is just a city in the middle centre of England. And that is it. That's all I know about Mick's childhood. And that really annoys me. I really don't like it when I can't find out about people's background and childhood, upbringing and all stuff like that, because I do think that it's important to these stories. I do think it is important to look back at someone's childhood to just see what happened, where things went wrong. Considering how much of a terrible person he is, I think we can assume that he didn't have the best upbringing and he also has daddy issues, okay? All we know from Mick's life is that he finished school, and as soon as he finished school, he joined the army at age 19. But from the age of 19, we do know quite a lot about Mick's life, and already at the age of 19, he was not a nice person. He was described as arrogant, a loudmouth, cocky, and Mick at the age of 19 and for the rest of his life, Mick thought that he was God's gift to this world, and especially God's gift to women. And he is just your typical narcissist. Like literally, if you looked up narcissist in the dictionary, there would be a picture of Mick Philpott. But not only was he a narcissist, he also was incredibly violent. He was known to have a very bad temper, and he was known to just snap at any time. And I didn't see this anywhere. I always like to clarify when I don't see anything and it's just my opinion. So I didn't see this anywhere, but I think he's a sociopath. 100%. And like I said, if you're from the UK, I'm pretty sure you know who Mick Philpott is. But there is so much more to this story than I even realised. And like I said, I've wanted to cover this case for the longest time because I vividly remember this case happening, because when this case was going on, like the trial of this case, I was in uni getting my criminology degree. And even back then, when I didn't know the full backstory of everything, Mick Philpott would make my blood boil. Just his face. You know when some people just have that face and it just makes you angry, it just makes you want to punch them? Mick Philpott has that face for me. Okay, so like I said, Mick, 19, he's not a good person, and he's just about to join the army. But weeks before he did join the army, he met a 15-year-old girl called Kim Hill. 15. She's a child. And Mick is an adult. Young adult, yes, I'll give you that, but I don't care. She's a child. But there is definitely a power imbalance here, like 100%. Mick is a very intimidating character. He is a bully. So he immediately enters into a relationship with this 15-year-old child. And right from the beginning, he was very controlling, he was manipulative, and he was violent, he was abusive. He pretty much controlled everything that she did. He told her how she was allowed to dress. He told her who she was allowed to be friends with, where she was allowed to go. He set curfews on when she was allowed out of the house, when she had to be back by. It's like, oh. And if Kim didn't abide by these rules, he would be physically violent towards her. He is very insecure as well, which all narcissists are really, aren't they? He would accuse Kim of cheating on him constantly. And obviously she wasn't, and she would say that she wasn't, but Mick never used to believe her. And because he would accuse her of cheating, he would actually run away from the army, like where he was posted. I don't know where, the base, I don't know. He was in the UK, he wasn't abroad or anything. He would return just to beat her up. The violence would get more and more extreme as their relationship went on, and I am talking about extreme. So there was this one incident where he broke her kneecap with a hammer. There was then this other incident, and I just cannot believe this. Like when I was reading this, I was like, oh my God, because I actually read this and it's come from Kim herself. So then there was this other time where he shot her in the groin with a crossbow. And he did this because he thought that she was dressed inappropriately. It's like you cannot make this stuff up. It's, oh my God. And I couldn't believe it when I was reading all of this, because it was this point in the story. Like, I didn't know any of this before my research. And I just couldn't believe it, because I knew that Mick was a bad person. But I was like, oh my God, he really has always been the worst. There were many other injuries as well that Kim suffered at the hands of Mick. She suffered a cracked cheekbone, a broken nose. She always had bruises. She had bite marks. There was even one time, this just makes me go really funny, where he would bend her fingers back until they broke. Oh! So the level of violence that Mick is showing towards Kim, it's extreme. It's a lot. It's really bad. And this violence wouldn't just happen behind closed doors. Oh no, no, he did it in public. I mean, he may not do the extreme stuff in public, like I doubt he would shoot her in the groin in public, but he would definitely beat her in public, in front of people, and no one would say anything. There was one time when Mick was in the pub, Kim was also there, and he was playing pool with his friends, and he called over to Kim to join him to play pool. He wanted a partner, and Kim didn't want to play. So she said, no, I don't want to play. So what did Mick do in retaliation? He picked up the pool cue and smashed it over Kim's face. And this was in a pub in front of loads of people, and not one person in that pub did anything. Not one person said anything. Nothing. And Mick was that typical manipulative narcissist, because whenever Kim did pluck up the courage to end the relationship or confront him about the violence, Mick would turn on the fake tears. He would turn on the crocodile tears. He would break down crying. He'd be like, I am so sorry. I promise my behavior will change. And he was also one of those typical narcissists that would turn the situation around and make themselves the victim. I think we all know somebody like that. So Kim would end up feeling sorry for Mick, and Kim would end up apologizing to Mick. And this is what narcissists do. So eventually in 1978, Kim had been with Mick for approximately 2 years now. She is around 17, and she decided that enough was enough. And Kim finally left Mick and went to live with her parents. And as you can imagine, this did not go down well with Mick at all. He was absolutely furious. And Mick wasn't exactly going to let this slide, so he planned out to get revenge. So on the 4th of July 1978, Mick broke into Kim's parents' house. He broke in the middle of the night, and it was just Kim and her mom at home. Kim's dad was out at work, and Mick broke in when Kim and her mom were just in their beds sleeping. So Mick broke in, and he decided to just sit in the living room. Just sit there, which is creepy as hell. He was sat on the sofa for a little while, and then all of a sudden he gets up, he goes to the kitchen, and he grabs a knife. He then went upstairs, and he just started stabbing Kim when she was sleeping. Kim woke up to being stabbed, and she was screaming, which then alerted her mom, Shirley. Shirley got up, ran to her daughter, saw what was happening, tried to wrestle Mick off of her daughter, and then Mick turned on Kim's mom, and Mick started stabbing Shirley as well. Mick stabbed Shirley, Kim's mom, a total number of 11 times before he turned back around and continued his attack on Kim. Now, this was not a quiet attack at all. Both Kim and Shirley were screaming. I'm sure Mick was probably making some noise as well. So all of this commotion did alert the neighbors, and the police were called. So when the police did arrive, Mick had finished his attack. He was actually waiting at the bottom of the stairs. I don't know if he just happened to be there or he was waiting for the police. I don't really know. But he was there at the bottom of the stairs. He was still holding the bloody knife, and he just looked up at the police. He looked up at the paramedics, and he just started laughing. And he said so chillingly, like, I cannot believe he said this. He said, quote, "You're wasting your time with that one. She's a goner." So obviously the paramedics rushed to Kim and Shirley. And Shirley, like I said, had been stabbed 11 times. It was mostly in the back. And very fortunately, she was still alive. And Kim had been stabbed a total number of 27 times. She survived, thank God, but I don't know how with the injuries that she sustained. Both of her lungs had been punctured, as well as her liver, her kidneys, and her bladder. Her stomach had been completely ripped open, and I mean completely ripped open. Her stomach was, I think it was a bit outside of her body. Mick had completely slashed her up, like completely gutted her basically. And at the time, no one thought that she was going to make it because her injuries were just that bad. But amazingly, after recovering for 4 months in the hospital, she did survive. Mick was arrested for this and charged for attempted murder of Kim and GBH, and he was found guilty, thank God, and he was sentenced to 7 years. 7 years. Like, seriously, what the actual hell? 7 years. Oh my God, this gets my blood boiling. No, 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 no. No. He committed GBH with intent, which I know carries a maximum sentence of life in prison, as well as attempted murder. But he didn't actually end up serving all 7 of those years. No. Get this. Get this. Oh my God. He ended up only serving 3 years. 3 years for attempted murder and GBH. Have you ever heard of something so ridiculous? And let me know if you knew any of that, like, backstory, because I didn't know any of that. Like, I could not believe it. Like, it just makes me angry because he should have been in prison from that moment on, and he should have been in prison for a very long time. And if he was given a more appropriate sentence for his crimes, today's case may not have taken place. Okay, so Mick gets out after 3.5 years. Sorry, half. That half makes all the difference. So he's around 25 or 26 because we don't know his birthday. And this is when he meets a woman called Pamela Lomax. And he actually went on to marry Pamela, and they had 3 kids together. And again, Mick was pretty much the same with Pamela as he was to Kim. He was very manipulative, he was very controlling, he was very violent and abusive. And Pamela ended up being trapped in a relationship with Mick for 10 years. She only ever got out of that relationship because Mick was bored of her, and he ended it and he moved on to someone else. So now that Mick was moving on to somebody else, he was now 37 years old. And this is when he starts up a relationship with a child called Heather, who is only 14 years old. So yeah, he is now grooming young teenagers. Yeah, and I do mean grooming. I'm not using that word lightly. So Mick first met Heather when he was fishing by a lake, because Heather, she was 14. She went by the lake to hang out with her friends. It was just like the little hangout place that her and her friends went. And Mick was fishing, and he would see Heather there quite often. And every time he went fishing, he would like try and get her attention. He would try and speak to her. And he would also be nice to Heather as well. He would buy her alcohol, he would buy her cigarettes. And Mick, being the absolute dick that he is, he would make Heather feel like she owed him. And Mick would put pressure on Heather to meet up with him on her own. And initially Heather did say no, and she did avoid it, but she didn't know how to keep saying no to Mick. I mean, he's very manipulative, and she's 14. So it wasn't long until she was meeting up with Mick approximately 4 times a week. And when they would meet up, Mick would tell her how much he loved her. He then started pressurizing her into having sex with him. And he ended up taking Heather's virginity when she's only 14, in a sleeping bag next to the lake. And I feel like I need to say this again. She is 14. This is statutory rape. This is rape. Heather's parents did try their hardest to stop this relationship. They did go to the police on a number of occasions to try and get the police involved. But Mick had manipulated Heather so much that every time they did kind of break up, Heather would just go back to him. And this kind of went on for approximately 2 years. So now Heather is 16 years old, and she runs away to go and live with Mick. And she moves into Mick's house, which is number 18 Victory Road in Derby, which is a pretty infamous house because that is where today's case takes place. So not long after Heather moves in, she does get homesick. I think she does regret moving in with Mick, and she wants to move back in with her parents. Wow, Mick was not going to have this, was he? And this is when Heather experienced for the first time Mick's violent side. And as soon as Heather told Mick that she wanted to go back and live with her parents, I don't even think she said, I want to break up. I think she just said, I want to go back and live with my parents. Well, Mick wasn't going to have this, and as soon as she said this, he pinned her to the floor and just started beating her. From that moment on, the abuse continued, and it only got worse. Heather at some point did fall pregnant, and it was around this time when she had fallen pregnant that Mick was now demanding sex from her at least 5 times a day. One time she did refuse because she doesn't want to have sex with him. Like, she can refuse, she can say no. No is a complete sentence, but no is not an option when it comes to Mick. And one time when she did say no, he raped her at knife point. Mick also forced Heather, at 16 years old, she's pregnant, to go out and get a job and earn money whilst he sat on his ass all day and watched TV. And then when she got her wages, he would take all of her wages. And Heather did go on to have 2 children with Mick. She had 2 sons, and Mick threatened to kill the children if she ever stepped out of line. Mick would also openly be violent towards Heather in front of the children. And as the 2 sons got older, Mick would encourage his sons to join in with the violence of their mother. And he would tell his sons to tell their mom, tell mommy what a naughty bitch she is. And of course, the son not knowing any different, because this is a part of his daily life. And the 3-year-old son would say things like that to his mom. And the 3-year-old son would also punch his mom under his dad's instructions. And when Mick did start to encourage the children to be violent towards their mom, this was the final straw for Heather. She was like, okay, no, I'm not letting this happen. So Heather, at the age of 20 at this point, she had now been with Mick for 6 years. She managed to finally escape with her 2 children and get away from Mick. So we're in the year 2000 now. Mick is approximately 44. And this is when Mick finds 19-year-old Mairead Duffy, who is a very important and key character in today's story. So yes, Mairead is 19. She is an adult, but she is still incredibly young. He's 44, and Mairead is incredibly vulnerable as well because she had literally just gotten out of an abusive relationship. Mairead was also a single mom when she met Mick. She had a son named Dwayne, and it wasn't long after the relationship started that Mairead and her son Dwayne had moved in to 18 Victory Road, Derby, which is Mick's house. And Mick was no different to Mairead. He was abusive, violent, manipulative, controlling, and it wasn't long after Mairead moved into the house that she also did fall pregnant. So Mick now had Mairead under his control, and you would think that he would be pretty content with that, wouldn't you? Because so far, up until this point of the story, he's only ever had one victim at a time. He's never been in a relationship with multiple people at the same time. Well, this was all about to change, because not long after meeting Mairead, Mick starts another relationship with a woman, or should I say girl, called Lisa, who is only 16 years old at this point. Another child. I just feel like I am repeating myself so much in this video, but it baffles me. How was he able to get away with this? Like, how? Like, oh. Okay, so Lisa was another incredibly vulnerable girl. She was a single mom at the time, and Mick targeted her. He thought that he could manipulate and groom her, which he did. So like I said, up until this point in the story, he has only ever been, as far as we are aware, he's only ever been in a relationship with one person at a time. So you may think, oh, okay, so is he keeping this relationship with Lisa secret? Is he going behind Mairead's back? Like, is he having an affair? No, none of that. He openly starts seeing Lisa as well as Mairead. Mick openly told Mairead, this is Lisa. She is my second girlfriend. And within weeks of meeting Lisa, Lisa moves into the house. So it is now Mick, Mairead, and Lisa in this. It's not even a 3-way relationship, because both Lisa and Mairead are only in a relationship with Mick. It's a very, very weird dynamic. And then obviously there's the children in the house as well. It's just all weird. It's just weird, okay? So Mick at this point is like 44, 45, and he's having a relationship with 19 or 20-year-old Mairead at this point, and now 16-year-old Lisa. Open, in front of the world, and no one is saying anything. And Mairead and Lisa had no say in this relationship. It's not like they were all for it. They eventually were groomed and manipulated into thinking that they were okay with it, but neither one of them had any say in this. Mick literally just turned up one day and was like, this is Lisa, she is my new girlfriend, and you have to accept it. So yeah, pretty weird. Pretty weird, but it gets weirder than that. Pretty much immediately after Lisa moved in, and I mean immediately, I'm not being dramatic there, she also fell pregnant. And then following this, Mick decided to propose to Mairead. So then Mick and Mairead are planning their wedding when Lisa is pregnant with Mick's child. And if you think things cannot get any weirder than that, well, you would be wrong, because when it eventually does come to the wedding day, guess who is bridesmaid? That's right. Lisa was bridesmaid. Make it make sense. How is this even real life? Lisa was the bridesmaid. For all we know, she could have been maid of honor at Mick and Mairead's wedding. And Lisa, at this point, is 7 months pregnant with Mick's child. I am sorry, but you know the part in the wedding where the person that's officiating the wedding says, does anybody in here object to this wedding? Why did no one bloody stand up? It's like, I personally don't know what grounds you have to stand up. Like, does anyone actually stand up and be like, yeah, I object? I don't know what the grounds are to object to a wedding, but I think a 16-year-old girl being pregnant by the man who is marrying another woman, I think that is a pretty good reason to object. And there is footage of this wedding, and you can see Lisa, her face has been blurred because her identity has been protected because of this case. And it's just heartbreaking to see how young she is, because it's all well and good us sitting here and saying like, oh, she was pregnant and she was a bridesmaid at the wedding and everything. But when you actually see the footage and you see how young she is, it's like, oh my God, she is so vulnerable. And Mick is just completely taking advantage of her, just like he has taken advantage of Mairead, just like he has taken advantage of many other girls before them. So after the wedding, Mick goes home with his new wife Mairead and his girlfriend Lisa, and he now runs the household as if he's like some sort of king. He controls both Lisa and Mairead through a combination of fear, manipulation, and violence. Mick was the same as he always is. It was incredibly violent. He was incredibly abusive. And again, he makes both Lisa and Mairead go out and get a job and earn money whilst he is sat on his arse all day just watching TV. And then he would take all of their wages because he would also control the finances of the house. So if you know the story of Mick Philpott, the thing that probably comes to mind first is obviously the tragic events of today's case, but then second is probably how many children he had. We did mention it briefly, but both Lisa and Mairead already do have one child with Mick at this point. Well, pretty much immediately after both of them had given birth, they were both pregnant again. And then after giving birth to those children, they were then both pregnant again, and then again. And again. Over the space of 5 years, Mairead gave birth to 4 of Mick's children, and Lisa gave birth to 3 of Mick's children. So there are now 9, I think, children living in this house, because we have 7 of Mick's own biological children, but then Mairead and Lisa already did have a child from another relationship. So I think there's 9 in this house. To be honest, when I was doing my research, it was a little bit wishy-washy how many children were living in the house at one time, because it does kind of change. And then remember that Mick also has 5 other children from previous relationships, from the relationship with Pamela and Heather. And then, because we can't mention everything because there is literally so much to this case, Mick also had 2, possibly 3 other children from other relationships and affairs that he had had. And he even had one child that he'd never even met. So he has a lot of children. He has like 15 or 16 biological children, and then he has stepchildren as well. And Mick wouldn't look after any of these children. It was up to the women to look after these children. So all of the children that were in the house, which is like 8 or 9, Mairead and Lisa had to look after the children. Mick wouldn't do anything. And then Lisa and Mairead also had to go out to work because Mick didn't want to go out to work. And then Lisa and Mairead also had to look after the household because Mick didn't want to do anything. So you may be thinking, why the hell did he have so many children? Was he just a loving and caring dad? Did he just want a big family? No. He saw these children as a source of income because all that Mick thought about was child benefits. So in the UK, I don't quite know how it is in other countries, but in the UK, there is this thing called child benefits where the government will help families in need and give them money to look after, bring up their children. And for every additional child you have, the government will pay you more money because you have more children to look after. And it's a great system, of course. In every single case where there is something like this, there will always be people that abuse the system. And Mick was one of those people. Mick was only having more and more children so he could get more money. Like, that is the only motivation he had for having children. It is thought that at one point, Mick was receiving up to £26,000 a year in child benefits alone. And there are some sources as well that said that he might have even been receiving up to £60,000 because obviously we don't know the exact figures. And then Mairead and Lisa also do have jobs, so they're bringing in money. So he was making a decent amount of money. But even with this situation that Mick had created for himself, he's a little king of his little kingdom. He literally makes me sick. He's raking in a decent amount of money. He has complete control over his wife and his girlfriend. You'd think he would be pretty satisfied, wouldn't you? Well, he wasn't. Mick used to complain that his house was too small. So Mick was still living at 18 Victory Road in Derby, and it was a 3-bedroom house. And this house was a council house that was provided to Mick and his family from the government, so he didn't have to pay for it. And Mick started to complain to the council that the house was too small for the 3 adults that lived there and all of the children, which was like 8 children at this time. And Mick was basically demanding a bigger house, but the council were like, there's nothing we can do. There's no bigger houses available right now. Like, there's literally nothing that we can do. And of course, Mick didn't like this answer. And Mick thought that he could get his own way. And can you blame him? I mean, he pretty much does get his own way in every situation. So Mick decided to go to his local TV news station to try and get this broadcast, to try and get attention, and essentially embarrassed Derby Council into giving him a new house, a bigger house. And this was around 2005-2006 that Mick makes his first TV appearance.
I should be getting a little bit of help from the council.
Oh yeah, Derby City Council, blah, 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 will help Mr. Philpott as much as possible, right? What have I got to do to get somebody to actually listen? It's not my fault, because at the end of the day, it's down to the council to be able to sort us out.
So remember that I said that Mick ended up on TV for all of the wrong reasons? Well, that basically starts from here, because Mick had all of these plans. He thought that he was going to go on telly. He thought that he was going to convince everyone to feel really sorry for him and essentially bully Derby Council into giving him a bigger house. Well, that completely backfired.
Good evening. He remains unemployed. He still lives with his wife and mistress, and he's still having children.
People saw Mick on TV, and instead of feeling sorry for him, he actually got a reputation for being the biggest scrounger in Britain. And I'm not sure if scrounger is a British word. I don't think I've heard anybody from a different country use that word. So if you don't know what scrounger means, it basically just means freeloader, someone that is trying to live at the expense of others. And this turned into a whole media circus, and it wasn't long until Mick was popping up on TV here, there and everywhere, almost trying to defend himself and to try and defend his lifestyle. He really was trying to get his 15 minutes of fame. He really was trying to turn himself into this little TV celebrity. And one of the TV shows that he popped up on was the Jeremy Kyle Show.
Today I want to discover the man behind the headlines and uncover the truth about the guy who has been branded Britain's biggest scrounger.
Now we don't have time to go into the Jeremy Kyle Show. And if you haven't heard of the Jeremy Kyle Show, it's the British version of the Jerry Springer Show. I actually think it's probably even worse than the Jerry Springer Show. And it's basically just where people go on to TV to air their dirty laundry, and the host embarrasses them and pulls people out from their past, and lie detector tests and paternity tests, and you guys know the kind of TV show that I'm talking about. And the whole intention behind these shows is to sort out your family drama, get to the bottom of things and work things out, when that is not the intention of these shows. The intention of these shows is pure entertainment at others' expense. So Mick goes on the Jeremy Kyle Show, and I don't think it went the way he wanted it to.
Get this, that, and the other. It's not fair. This country's going to pot five.
Hang on a minute. I've not said I can't get this, I can't get
You want
that.
a bigger house,
Listen, I'm going
don't
to tell
you?
you something. You're
Cause
going to criticise my family, pal, and my kids. I'll criticise you as much as I want.
Sorry,
this is a free
excuse me, when
country.
did I-
Do what I-
Because everyone could see right through him. Everyone could see how cocky and narcissistic he was. He brought out Mairead, his wife, on the show. He also brought out Lisa, his girlfriend. And it turns into this huge drama. And Mick and Jeremy Kyle are shouting at one another, and it's just all very dramatic, okay?
Well, there's three of us in the house, but it works like a normal family would.
Where is the dignity in two 20-year-old something women allowing a man twice their age to have sex with them? Explain to me.
Well,
Is
he's
that
not-
not sexist?
No, he's not doing it behind my back. He's
Lisa
open
was your
about it.
bridesmaid at your wedding!
Right, you just tell them what we said.
So you told her what to say as well?
I'll tell you what, I'll say it. Right? You lot are criticising us for being as a threesome. We don't do threesomes.
I know that, we
Full
said
stop.
that.
And then the next TV show that he went on, it was kind of like this reality show with politician Anne Widdecombe, and she was going around people's houses, and I don't really know what the show was called, but he went on this TV show as well. And Mick is showing Anne around his house, telling her what his life is like with his wife and his girlfriend.
Jesse.
I'm happy. I've got my two wives here. We've had, I say, two wives, not one. And I've got my kids and I've got my family. That's all I care about. Nothing else.
This is my wife, Mairead.
Hello, Mairead.
This is going to
Hello.
sound strange. This is my second wife, Lisa.
Hello, Lisa. How have you got two wives? They don't allow it in this country.
Well, no, but I class them as two wives.
I see.
If the country don't like it, it's tough.
Get a job.
I'm looking after my
Get
kids.
a job.
Listen, this shows you what a you are,
Get
doesn't
a
it?
job.
You, useless, you are.
Yeah,
Seriously,
yeah.
You're like
Yeah.
the rest. Talk
Yeah.
to that because you're not worth the
I work,
extension.
mate.
And another thing that I actually forgot to mention, which is just another example of the kind of person Mick is, his favourite word for women was bitch. He would refer to every single woman as a bitch, and he did this quite often in that show with Anne Widdecombe.
Every bitch out there that's got children who's looking
What's
at...
that expression you
who?
just used?
That's what I'm going to
What's
use.
that expression
All right,
you
every
just-
woman...
Is that how you describe the ladies?
These are my ladies, are different.
Oh, but everybody else is
Why
a
don't you
bitch.
shut your mouth and let me have my say?
So when he's showing Anne around, brace yourself right now. If you're eating, please stop, okay? So he shows Anne the front garden, and then in the front garden is a caravan, which he refers to as the sex caravan. And this just makes me feel really sick. He was telling Anne that every night he would alternate between Lisa and Mairead, who he would take into that sex caravan. And Mairead and Lisa had no say in this, by the way. I probably should say that.
Now, normally, if this caravan's rocking, you better not come knocking because this is where it all happens. As you can see, this is a nice, nice big king-size bed. This is where the action takes place, if you know what I mean. I'm not going to say too much about it, but yeah. One night I'll have Mairead in here, and then next night I'll have Lisa in.
And if that doesn't make you feel sick, I don't know what will. So Mick goes on to have 2 more children with Lisa and Mairead. There is 10, maybe 11, because the numbers aren't always clear, children in that house. They're still in that same 3-bedroom house. It's just like, why are you having more children? Like, why? This is just not fair. Like, we've got to take a moment now to just think about the kind of living conditions that those 10 or 11 children were in. And things stay like this for another 5 years until we get to February of 2012. And this is when the significant part of today's case takes place, which is just crazy to me because I feel like we've already done a video with how much we've actually covered with Mick and how much he's actually done already. So it's February 2012, and this is when Lisa decided that she had had enough. She wanted to leave Mick. So one day she took her 5 children to the swimming pool, but she didn't take them to the swimming pool. In actuality, she just left and she never came back, and Mick absolutely lost it. So Mick started phoning her up. He started threatening her, saying things like, one day you'll pay for this. How dare you do this to me? You'll come to regret this. You can't live without me. He was also saying things like, I will make you pay for this. So ultimately, Lisa did end up going to the police about Mick because she was genuinely scared for herself, but most importantly, her children's safety, because she knew what Mick was like. But Mick was not happy about this. He was not happy that the police had gone involved. He was not happy that he was being prevented from seeing Lisa. So he decided that he was going to start a legal battle to try and get custody of the 5 children. But unfortunately, when it comes to Mick Philpott, we are not dealing with someone who is a rational person. He was not going to let Lisa get away with this, and he wanted revenge. And this is when the tragic events of today's case begin to unfold. So Mick had a court date, which was the 11th of May 2012, and at this court date he was expected to present evidence of why he should get custody of the children. And Mick wanted to ensure that there was no way that Lisa could win this custody battle. So Mick starts to think, how am I going to make Lisa look like an absolutely terrible person, a terrible mother? And on the 10th of May 2012, which was the day before the hearing, this is when Mick carried out his plan. On the evening of the 10th of May 2012, Mick was just at home in 18 Victory Road. He was there with Mairead, and he was there with his friend Paul Mosley. Paul and Mairead both knew about Mick's plan, and they were both happy to go along with it. And I feel like we do just need to take a second here to speak about Mairead, because up until this point in the story, Mairead was a victim. She had suffered terrible abuse because of Mick. Mick had targeted her. She was so vulnerable, and he had taken advantage of her over and over again. He was very abusive, he was very violent. But there was a point where Mairead went from being victim to being complicit. Going forward from this point, Mairead's actions make her just as guilty and just as despicable as Mick, and I just thought that it was important to point that out because I know that Mairead was a victim, and we saw this in the Cameron video, Cameron Hooker with Janice, and I just thought it was important to point that out because I am under no illusion Mairead obviously was a victim, but she is not innocent at all, and there could have been so many opportunities where she could have stopped what is going to happen from happening. So on this night, Mick and Mairead put the 6 children to bed, and then they went back downstairs to their friend Paul. And after having a few drinks together, the 3 of them decide to have a threesome on the pool table just downstairs with 6 kids upstairs. It's like time and a place, people. And then after the little threesome at around 3:30 a.m., Mick decides that that is the time that they should carry out the plan. And the most unimaginable tragedy occurred. So Mick picked up a petrol can and he started pouring petrol just inside the front of his door and at the bottom of the stairs. Then, whilst all 6 of the children were asleep upstairs, the 3 adults set alight the petrol and then made a quick escape from the house, just leaving all 6 of the children asleep in their bed. Once they were outside, Mairead called 999 to report that her house was on fire and that 6 of her children were inside.
Mrs. Philpott. Mrs. Philpott? How many kids are in the house, Mrs. Philpott? Where are they? 6 of them. Sorry? 6 of them.
When Mairead was on the phone, neighbours started to notice that the house was on fire, and 2 of the neighbours, who happened to be brothers, Jamie and Darren Butler, rushed over to help. And as soon as they found out that there were 6 children trapped inside the house, the 2 brothers did absolutely everything that they could to try and get those children out. Whilst these 2 brothers are literally trying to get in the house, they are trying to find some sort of entrance into this house to get the children out, both of them are noticing, why isn't Mick helping? Why isn't he doing more? So the 2 brothers run around to the back of the house and they notice that there's already a ladder propped up against the house that goes up to an upstairs window, and that window has already been smashed. And the 2 brothers were just like, this is weird, like, what the hell? Thick black smoke is pouring out of the house. It's pouring out of that smashed window, and the 2 brothers do try and go up the ladder to get in the house through that smashed window, but there is just no way that they can get through this thick black smoke. I mean, this is a petrol fire. Mick also makes a half attempt at going up the ladder to try and get his children out. It's very half-hearted. He doesn't really try at all. He's just doing it for appearances. And firefighters do arrive on the scene pretty quickly, and when they go through the front door, they are met with the thickest black smoke imaginable. They cannot even see their hand in front of their face. And the firefighters manage to battle through the flames, and they bring all 6 children out of the house. All of the children were treated outside of the house by the paramedics. Dwayne, who was the eldest child in the house, he was 13 at the time, he did survive the fire and he was rushed straight to hospital. But tragically, the 5 younger children did not make it. They had all suffered smoke inhalation, and very sadly, all 5 of those children were pronounced dead at the scene. These were Jade, age 10, John, age 9, Jack, age 7, Jesse, aged 6, and Jaden, aged 5. And these 5 children were completely innocent. They did not ask to be brought into the madness of Mick's world. And all 5 of those children lost their lives because of the decisions their own parents made. Mick and Mairead. So if you hadn't realised by now, the fire was all part of Mick's plan to get revenge on Lisa. Basically, Mick thought that he could frame Lisa for the fire, get everyone to think that it was Lisa that started the fire, and that way they wouldn't grant custody to Lisa, they would grant custody of the 5 children to Mick. Mick thought that it was going to be so easy to frame Lisa, and there was no way that anyone would give Lisa custody of any children because she started this fire. So the actual plan of Mick's, because the way the events unfolded were not part of his plan. So the original plan of Mick was to start this fire in his house, make it look like it was Lisa, and at the very last moment, Mick was supposed to climb up the ladder that was already there and save all 6 children and be the hero of the story. Mick really is that delusional that he thinks that he can control fire. And Mairead went along with this. She was perfectly happy to put her children in harm's way just to please Mick. And this is what I mean. Mairead, in my opinion, is just as responsible for this fire. She helped start this fire. Both of them thought that they could do this, get away with it, and no one would be hurt. And I don't even know why Mick's friend, Paul, even went along with this. I don't know. Maybe he was scared of Mick. I think he's just as bad as Mick, if I'm being honest. So Dwayne, who was the eldest child, was the only survivor from the fire. And initially he was rushed to Derby Hospital, but he needed to be moved to a specialist hospital in Birmingham because he needed emergency support. Like, his injuries, like his smoke inhalation, like it was serious. And Birmingham is about an hour away from Derby, so not the closest, but definitely not the furthest. And Mick and Mairead were offered transport from Derby to Birmingham so they could go with Dwayne. And Mick was just like, I don't think it's going to work for me. I've got court in the morning, so yeah, I don't think I'm going to go with Dwayne to the hospital. You have just lost 5 of your children. You are responsible for losing 5 of your children. And your only remaining child that survived from the fire that you caused is clinging onto their life. And you are not going to go to hospital with them. I literally have no words. I really don't. It's behaviour like this that I just can never wrap my head around, because we know that Mick started the fire, but the authorities at this point didn't. Even if he didn't care about Dwayne, because let's face it, he didn't care about Dwayne. He didn't care about anyone but himself. Why wouldn't he play along? I'm the caring dad. Like, why wouldn't he play along? This is what I don't get about these people. They hatch all of these plans and everything, and they think that they're going to get away with it, but then they don't even bloody play the part. But eventually, after a lot of persuasion from many people around Mick and Mairead did eventually go to the hospital with Dwayne. But when Mick was at the hospital, he barely spent any time by Dwayne's side. Instead, he was going around laughing and joking around the hospital and being incredibly inappropriate with the nurses in the hospital. And I mean incredibly inappropriate, actually sexual assault. He was touching nurses inappropriately, and I just cannot wrap my head around it. It's like, how is this man allowed to get away with everything that he does? Like I said, Dwayne was literally clinging to his life. He had suffered terrible smoke inhalation, and very, very sadly, Dwayne also passed away 3 days after being in the hospital. So now 6 innocent children have died because of Mick, Mairead and Paul. Following the death of Dwayne, Mick and Mairead, but especially Mick, went on with their unbelievable behaviour. Both of them were seen laughing and joking and just having a good time out and about. Both of them were actually seen shopping, and the police had started their investigation because obviously they quickly discovered that the fire had been started with petrol. So they immediately knew that the fire had been started intentionally, so they needed to figure out, okay, well, who started this fire? And at the same time, the whole of the UK were mourning the loss of these 6 innocent children. The news of the fire had made national news. It was on the news every single day. It was on every single newspaper. It was absolutely everywhere. It was all anyone could talk about. And because of the heartbreaking news, donations were flooding in. People were trying to support the Philpott family in any way that they could. However, what the public didn't realise is that Mick and Mairead were using all of these donations to go shopping, to treat themselves. And Mick was absolutely loving all of this attention that he was getting. It was like he was this mini little celebrity again. So 5 days after the fire, Mick decided that he wanted to hold a press conference. So basically Mick only wanted to call a press conference because the story had started to drop out of the media a little bit, and Mick didn't want to let go of his fame. The press conference was going to go ahead and it was going to get shown on TV nationwide. But what Mick didn't realise at the time is that this press conference would be the beginning of his downfall. So before the press conference, Mick met with the police officers that were there, running the press conference. And from the get-go, the officers thought that Mick was acting strange. He was just acting weird. He wasn't acting normal. Mick came in all jolly. He came in laughing. He kind of came bounding in. And Mick was like, oh, let's get this thing started, as if he was really excited about the prospect that he was going to be on TV. He was just rubbing his hands together like it was a big game, like it was a TV show. And then when it was the actual press conference, because obviously that was just behind the scenes, when it was the actual press conference, Mick completely changed and he turned on the crocodile tears.
First of all, I want to thank my 3 oldest children because they helping us to cope with what's going on. Excuse me a minute.
And this has to be, I think anyway, I don't know, it has to be the most infamous fake press conference ever in the UK. And we've covered a couple of fake press conferences in the UK on this channel. Think of Karen Matthews, Tracy Andrews, but the one of Mick and Mairead is probably the most infamous. And Mick is sat there feeling all sorry for himself. He's dabbing his face with a tissue, even though there's no tears, and he's trying to make the faces as if he's crying. And it's so obvious that he's not crying. I mean, that tissue is staying dry. And Mairead is just sat there next to him, and her head's down, and her forehead is all wrinkled, and she's pulling the face as if she's crying and if she's sad, and it's just oh my God, get over yourselves. So then Mick starts to talk and he rambles on. He thanks everyone and their mom for what they've done. He literally lists off people. I want to thank this person. I want to thank that person.
And then there's a young lad called Daniel Stevenson who tried to get in the house the same as myself, Joe across the road, and the Butler brothers. And of course, it's the poor firemen, the police, the ambulances, the doctors, the nurses, literally everybody.
It's like he is accepting the award of Worst Dad of the Year and he's giving his acceptance speech. Not one point in the whole of the press conference did Mick ever address the audience and ask for help, because that was the whole point of this press conference. Because at this point in the investigation, nobody knew who had started the fire. So that's why Mick had apparently called the press conference to get the public's help. But he never once, not one time, did he ask for help. He never said, help me find the people that killed my children. That is what any parent would say. But Mick didn't say any of that. And Mairead didn't say anything. So the police officer that was at the press conference just found all of this behaviour just incredibly suspicious. And from this point on, because of the press conference, Mick became a suspect. So the police start looking into Mick and Mairead. And obviously, Mick's original plan was to frame Lisa. And originally, the police did suspect Lisa to begin with because of obviously all the issues and the custody battle that was going on. So the police initially did look into Lisa, but she had a solid alibi and she was ruled out pretty quickly and Mick's plan backfired. So the police look into Mick's background and it's pretty troubling, isn't it? They see that he was convicted of attempted murder and that alone made them suspect Mick even more. But at the moment, they only had their suspicions. They didn't have any solid evidence. So they needed some way to prove their suspicions of Mick. And the solution that the police came up with was to get secret recordings of Mick and Mairead. They wanted to bug the hotel room that they were staying in. Obviously, they were staying in a hotel because their house was burnt down. The police wanted to bug the hotel, and the powers that the police have to do things like this are very limited. The police are not allowed to do this for just anyone. So the fact that the police were even allowed to bug this hotel room says a lot, says how strong the suspicion was. So they bugged the hotel room and the police just sat back and listened. Well, whilst Mick and Mairead were in the hotel room, their friend turns up, Paul Mosley, the other despicable person a part of this plan, and all three of them were recorded in that hotel room. And in those recordings, all three of them were heard colluding with each other about trying to get their story straight.
Know something? They've got nothing on me. Nothing.
Mick was heard saying, quote, "Are we sticking to the story? I didn't mean to do it. On my life. Have they got any evidence on you? They've got nothing on me." Again, if you're eating, stop, because this makes me feel sick. In one of the recordings, Mick turned to Mairead and instructed her to give Paul Mosley a blowjob to, quote, "keep him sweet." And the police had to hear that. Ugh. No. Following these recordings, all three of them were arrested and charged with manslaughter. They all pled not guilty and a trial date was set for February 2013. At the trial, Lisa testified against Mick and Mairead. Heather, the woman that Mick had groomed from the age of 14, also took the stand to testify. She was 33 at the time of the trial and she very bravely gave evidence of everything that went on between her and Mick. And after the jury had heard all of the evidence, especially the character evidence of Mick, and of course the jury heard all of the audio recordings in that hotel room, the jury found all three, Mick, Mairead and Paul, they found all three guilty of manslaughter. And they were found guilty of manslaughter and not murder because the original plan wasn't to kill the children. They wanted to save the children. So that's why they weren't charged with murder. They were charged with manslaughter instead. Both Paul and Mairead were sentenced to 17 years and Mick was sentenced to life in prison, but he has to serve a minimum of 15 years, which in my opinion is not long enough. Again, Mick seems to have gone off pretty lightly. And this is just an absolutely horrific case because 6 innocent children were taken far too soon. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Before the trial took place in June 2012, a funeral was held for all 6 children and it was an incredibly sad event. So many people turned up. It was so sad, and Mick and Mairead were already in custody at this point, so they did not attend the funeral. Jaden, age 5, was described as a bouncy and happy little boy. Jesse, age 6, was said to be a cheerful little character who loved snuggling up with his brother to watch films. Jack, age 7, was described as cute, cuddly and content, and just loved spending time with his brothers playing video games and watching TV. John, aged 9, had a huge personality and loved having friendly competitions with his older brother Dwayne. His ambition was to become a soldier in the army. Jade, aged 10, was said to be creative and a beautiful young girl with a permanent smile on her face. And Dwayne, aged 13, was described as a charming and caring young boy who had taken on the role of family protector. And it's just horrible, isn't it? People like Mick make me so angry. Oh God. I get emotional sometimes in these videos, but wow. I think it's because I actually remember this happening. Like, I vividly remember this happening, and I can remember how incredibly sad it was. And Mick, it makes me angry that he only got life, but he only has to serve 15 years. That's nothing. That's absolutely nothing. And Mairead and Paul are already out of prison. They're already out living their lives. And in my opinion, Mick should never be released, ever. Ever. He has proven that he cannot change. And it's just incredibly sad that 6 innocent children lost their lives because of a narcissist, somebody that thought they could play God. So, today's case, we are going to be talking about the case of Timothy Jones Jr. And oh my God, this man. This case is not a nice one. It isn't. Timothy was a father to 5 young children, and he was not a nice person. He was not a nice dad. He was controlling, he was manipulative, and he was very abusive. He literally didn't care about the well-being of anyone around him, including his kids. The only person he ever cared about was himself. And unfortunately, Timothy's controlling and abusive behavior just ended in complete tragedy. And I do need to give a warning for today's video. We are going to be talking about domestic abuse, child abuse, and also the murder of young children. So please just be aware of that before going on and listening to this case. But this case hasn't been widely covered. Again, I'm really shocked that more people don't know about this case. But another thing that is incredibly infuriating about this case is that there were so many system failures. So because of that, and because this case doesn't really have much coverage, I thought it was an important one to bring to you guys, but it is a heavy one. Just going to warn you. But let's just jump in. By the way, I'm really sorry if you can hear Daisy barking. It's currently the bank holiday weekend in the UK and everyone is out and about. There's people walking around. Everyone is in their gardens and it's setting her off all the time. So if you hear a little yapping in the background, it's Daisy downstairs. Timothy Jones Jr. was born in 1982. I couldn't find an exact birthday for him, and it is believed that he grew up in Mississippi before later moving to Lexington, South Carolina, where today's case takes place. Now, Timothy had a very troubled childhood, and I say that a lot, but I truly mean it for Timothy. And there is also a very complicated family history that I am going to go through, but it is very complicated. I've tried to make it as simple as possible, but there are going to be a lot of characters, so bear with me. But there were 3 key people in the upbringing of Timothy. That's Timothy's dad, mom, and his grandmother. All 3 of them also had a very troubled childhood. So we'll start with the grandmother, whose name was Roberta. Now, from a very young age, Roberta suffered from very traumatic sexual abuse. And this was all at the hands of her own stepfather. Her stepfather repeatedly raped her, and from being raped at the age of 12, Roberta fell pregnant. You heard that right. She fell pregnant with her stepfather's child. This child would go on to be Timothy's dad, but it's going to be really confusing because Timothy's dad's name is also Timothy. So confusing when that happens. So then after Timothy Jones Sr. was born, Roberta was forced into marrying her stepfather. I know, like, what? Really? It's like horrifying. What the actual hell? But thankfully, at the age of 17, Roberta managed to get away from the clutches of her abusive stepfather. So that was the grandmother's background, Roberta. So now let's move on to Timothy's dad, Timothy Sr. So obviously Timothy Sr. was born out of the result of his mom, Roberta, being raped by her stepdad. And obviously Roberta's stepdad is Timothy Sr.'s actual biological dad. But Timothy Sr. was forced to live with that abusive man for the first 5 years of his life before his mom managed to escape at age 17. But even after Roberta escaped, it wasn't exactly smooth sailing for the family because Roberta would drink heavily. She was also prone to violent outbursts, and Timothy Sr. witnessed his mom, Roberta, being physically abusive to her new husband. So that whole situation is obviously very traumatic, very chaotic. So now let's move on to Timothy Jr.'s mom, Cynthia, because Cynthia also had a very troubled upbringing. Her childhood was full of abuse and she was molested by her own father. And obviously this is going to have a lasting impact on anyone, and it did have a lasting impact on Cynthia. She had a lot of issues because of this. And then when Cynthia was aged 16, she met Timothy Sr. They both dropped out of school, got married. Cynthia soon fell pregnant, and then she gave birth to Timothy Jr., who this video is all about. So yes, complicated family background, and that is a very simplified version because there was so much more detail, but it was already confusing enough. But if I just break it down for you. So the grandmother, Roberta, was raped repeatedly by her stepdad, who she was then forced to marry. Out of those rapes was born Timothy Sr. He obviously had a very abusive childhood as well. He witnessed a lot of abuse. Then we've got Cynthia, who also was abused as a child, sexually and physically. And then Timothy Jr. is born out of all of that chaos. And unfortunately, as we quite often see in these cases, the cycle of abuse doesn't end there because of course it goes on to affect Timothy Jr.'s life. Okay, so we're now going to get on to Timothy Jr.'s childhood. Almost immediately after he was born, it was troubled because this all started with his mom, Cynthia, and her behavior towards Timothy. Now, her behavior was very, very strange. If Timothy was ever upset, crying as a baby, Cynthia would just let him cry, let him scream. She also wouldn't let anybody else comfort him either. And in order to stop Timothy from crying as a baby, she would give him ice cold baths. But that's not all. There was a lot of other troubling behavior as well, because there was this one thing where Cynthia was really worried about having a quote fat baby. So she would feed Timothy laxatives as a baby, which, what? I have never heard of that before, but force feeding a baby laxative, that has got to be dangerous. I obviously don't know what kind of effect that could have on a baby, but surely that is not good. And her erratic behavior wasn't just towards Timothy either. It was just day to day. Like, her behavior was just erratic. She was prone to violent outbursts, just very extreme mood swings. She would also destroy things around the home. She would quite often just get a knife and start cutting things up. And then one day, Cynthia took baby Timothy and just disappeared. She just got up and left with the baby, and she went missing for months. Now, Timothy's dad, Timothy Sr., did manage to track down Cynthia and the baby, and eventually, because of this situation, Timothy Sr. did win custody of Timothy Jr. And then following this incident, Cynthia was actually diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she was placed in an institution for treatment, and she was held indefinitely. And she was held for a very long time. It would actually be 2 decades before Timothy Jr. would ever see his mom again. And Timothy Jr. was only 2.5 years old when his mom went to the institution. So for the majority of Timothy Jr.'s life, he is brought up and raised by his dad, Timothy Sr. So like I said, very chaotic. The whole family is very chaotic. All of them come from a very distressing, troubling background. Timothy Jr. went through some absolutely horrific things, and he was so incredibly young. He was basically neglected. His mom was feeding him laxatives, and he was given ice cold baths. So Timothy Sr. now has full custody. So Timothy Jr., Timothy Sr. are both now living with the grandmother, Roberta. And unfortunately, things don't really get much better from here. Timothy's dad would go on to remarry, and Timothy's grandmother would also remarry. The thing is, they're all abusive. all of them. Timothy witnessed his own dad being abusive to his new wife, and Timothy also witnessed his grandmother being abusive to her new husband. Everywhere that Timothy goes, there is abuse, there is dysfunction. So not only was Timothy witnessing a lot of domestic abuse, he was also witnessing a lot of substance abuse as well. And substance abuse became normal to him. It was completely normalized in that household. And when Timothy entered his teenage years, he started experimenting and abusing substances himself. And then when Timothy was 15 years old, a very significant event happened that would impact him for the rest of his life because he got into a very severe accident. And this was a car accident. He was in the car with his cousin who was driving under the influence, and the car somehow ended up going off the road and hitting a tree. Now, following this accident, Timothy was in the hospital for 2 days. And it was found as a result from this car accident, Timothy suffered a traumatic brain injury. We have another head injury. They are very common, and we've done quite a few head injuries recently. Like Harvey Gutman had a head injury, didn't he? Arthur Hutchinson, which was the podcast episode, he had a head injury. And now we're seeing it in today's case. And just like those other 2 cases, after Timothy had this head injury, everything changed. His whole personality just changed. Following the accident, Timothy was now suffering with depression, paranoia. He was hearing voices and having hallucinations. But not only that, he was already abusing drugs and alcohol, but after the accident, his drug and alcohol consumption got even worse. And then there were 2 more significant things that happened in Timothy's childhood. The first was that he joined the Navy. This was something that he had always dreamed of, and he was actually looking forward to the physical discipline. But his time in the Navy was very short-lived because he got discharged after only 6 weeks after being caught with drugs. And then the other significant incident is that when Timothy was 19 years old, he went to prison. Now, this had happened because after the Navy, he kind of fell into a life of crime, and he had stolen a few cars and forged some checks. Now, inside the prison, it was weird. He was sent to, I don't know if it was a special prison or something like that. Maybe it was because he was 19 years old. I really don't know. But a part of his prison sentence, he was forced to undergo a very strict boot camp. And this boot camp included severe, extreme physical exercise. And take note of this because this plays a very important role in today's case. So again, even in his teenage years, we're seeing a lot of dysfunction, a lot of drug and alcohol abuse, brutal boot camp prison regimes. And unfortunately, all of this, especially the prison boot camp, would definitely shape Timothy's character going forward. So it's now 2003. Timothy is currently 21 years old, which I cannot get over how young he is, and he has gone through so much. So he's currently just got out of prison, and he thinks, right, it's finally time to turn my life around. And this is when Timothy finds religion. He joins a Pentecostal church that has Christian fundamentalist beliefs. He also goes on to college. He gets a degree in computer engineering. He finds himself a good job that pays pretty well, and he also meets his future wife, Amber. Now, Timothy and Amber hit it off straight away, and within weeks of meeting, Timothy has already proposed to Amber. Now, it's said that Timothy's family was strongly against this proposal because they were so young and they had only just met. They had only known each other, a maximum 3 weeks at this point, and they were already engaged. It's like marriage is not something that you should just rush into, you know? But Timothy's family also accused Timothy of only proposing to Amber because his church, his beliefs, didn't believe in sex before marriage. So they thought Timothy was only marrying Amber so he could have sex with her. But Timothy didn't care about what his family thought. He ignored their wishes. And within 6 weeks of meeting, Timothy and Amber were married. It's like, I don't like to criticize anybody's relationship. Everyone's relationship is on a different path. But 6 weeks and you're already married? That's too fast. It's too fast, isn't it? The couple quickly go on to have 3 children together. Timothy finds a new job. It's actually a very well-paid job, this next job. He finds a job at the tech giant Intel, and he's on an $80,000 a year salary. And this is where the whole family move from Mississippi to Lexington in South Carolina, and the family move into a trailer. And at first, everything seemed great. Everything seemed to be going great for Amber. Timothy was a good father, he was a good husband, he had a good job, he provided for the family, but then everything began to change. And this was all because of the strict religious code that Timothy lived by. And he started to impose these strict rules on Amber. He told her that she needed to be a subservient wife. She was no longer allowed to wear makeup. She wasn't allowed to cut her hair. She wasn't even allowed to wear trousers. She was expected to stay at home, quit her job. She wasn't allowed to have a job. She was expected to clean the house, basically be a housewife, and give birth to kids. That is all she was good for, taking care of the home and giving birth to children. And she also needed to stop spending so much time with friends and family. She basically had to give up any life or identity that she had before Timothy. She was expected to do everything that her husband wanted and needed. Meanwhile, Timothy could do whatever he wanted. He didn't follow any of these rules himself. And if Amber ever stepped out of line, Timothy would be physically violent towards her. So now Timothy has become an abuser himself. And unfortunately, things don't get better. They actually get worse. So we now get to 2011. Timothy is almost 30 years old, and the 3 children are getting a little bit older now. And this is when Timothy is reported for the first time to the Department of Social Services, which is something that would be reoccurring a lot from this moment on. Timothy was first reported to the DSS for very violent and volatile behavior towards his neighbors. And in one instance, which is probably the incident that got him reported, he got into an argument with one of his neighbors, and it got that heated that Timothy threatened to shoot his neighbor's dog. So Timothy was reported, and the DSS came out, and they didn't find any signs or any evidence of physical abuse towards the children at this point. However, they did notice that the home was a mess. It was absolutely filthy. It was disgusting. The toilet didn't work. The vents on the trailer were completely blocked with dirt. There was just rubbish all over the floor, and there were cockroaches. But it wasn't just filthy, because dangerous tools were also left out in the reach of the children. Also, the children's clothes were dirty. The children were dirty. The DSS took one look around and said, this needs to change. So the DSS made a report. They reported everything, and they stated in the report, quote, "The children were suffering from maltreatment and neglect that presented a substantial risk of physical injury." And because of this report, the family were set up with a so-called safety plan. But unfortunately, this so-called safety plan was never followed up on. Things at the home just continued on the way they were, and they slowly got worse. So it's around 2012 now, and Amber has had 2 more children. And throughout the years, even more reports were made to the DSS. Every time someone from the DSS came out, evaluated the situation, said that things needed to change, set up a so-called safety plan, and then that was it. Safety plan was never followed up on. No one ever went back out to the house as a follow-up, nothing. Most of the reports actually were related to Amber and the domestic violence towards Amber, not the children. And a lot of the time it was actually Amber that was reporting Timothy to the DSS. One report said that Timothy had threatened to break Amber's neck in front of the children. There were reports that Timothy would regularly spit on her. There was even one report that Timothy had headbutted Amber so hard she completely blacked out. And all of this that I have just said happened in front of the children. Another time, Timothy threatened to kill Amber, chop her up, and feed her to the pigs. And even though the reports were saying that there is no physical abuse towards the children, right now this is emotional abuse. And then there was one more incident that was truly terrifying, and Amber thought that she and her children were going to die. So this all started when the family were out shopping, and whilst they were out shopping, Timothy and Amber had started arguing, and this argument followed them in the car on the way home. So they're driving home, they're driving very, very fast, and Timothy turns to Amber and says, "Do you want to play chicken?" On the other side of the road, Timothy sees a huge 18-wheeler truck. So Timothy, seeing this 18-wheeler approaching, swerves the car onto the other side of the road, making sure that only the passenger side of the car is on the other side of the road. And the passenger side of the car is directly lined up with the 18-wheeler. I also want to point out that the children are in the back of the car. Amber, the children everyone is screaming, apart from Timothy, obviously he's having the time of his life right now. Amber is yelling at Timothy to stop, to get on the right side of the road. And Timothy, the whole time, is just laughing. He's driving faster and faster towards this 18-wheeler truck. And then at the very last second, Timothy swerves back onto the right side of the road. They were literally seconds from a severe accident that would have killed everyone in the car. How can you do that to your wife and 5 children? How can you do that? Timothy every day is becoming more violent, more volatile, and even though even more reports have been made to the DSS, every time they come out, they just make this safety plan and then nothing is ever done. So we now get to the summer of 2012, and Amber at this point had just had enough. After years of being abused, after being isolated from everyone, manipulated, forced to give up her life, her identity, Amber started a relationship with a neighbor. Now, it didn't take long, of course, for Timothy to find out about this. After he did, he was furious because obviously he expected Amber to be this subservient wife, and unsurprisingly, Timothy reacted in a very extreme way. He just gathered up all his belongings, packed up his bags, and left, and took all 5 children with him. He traveled back to Mississippi to live closer to family, and he left Amber behind in South Carolina. Timothy then blocked Amber having access with the children at all. Timothy ended up filing for divorce and asking for custody of all 5 children. Now, when Timothy was asked the reason for the divorce, he said that Amber was having an affair and, quote, kept a sloppy home. He also said that Amber had poor lifestyle choices. This man has some nerve, doesn't he? Amber did try to fight the case, but because she didn't have a job, remember this was all because of Timothy that she didn't have a job, she didn't have any money to hire an attorney. She also didn't have any connections with friends and family. She had cut off ties completely to her old life because of Timothy. She had no way, at least she felt like she had no way to fight this. There was also a part of her though that did think that Timothy would be a good dad. He would look after the children, and maybe the children would be better off with him because he had a job. He had a very well-paying job, and she thought, well, I don't have a job, I don't have any money, I can't provide for the children, so maybe they would be better off with Timothy, which obviously that is not the case, but that all comes down to the fact that she has been abused and manipulated for all of those years. And eventually, in late 2013, Timothy won the case, and he won custody of all 5 children. Amber was allowed visitation every other weekend and on a few holidays. But unfortunately, this decision would be a huge turning point in this case, because everything from this moment on is a huge downward spiral. And from Timothy getting custody of all 5 children, that directly leads to the tragic events of today's case. So at some point after getting custody of the 5 children, Timothy and the 5 children do move back to the trailer in Lexington, South Carolina. Obviously, Amber is not there right now, and he was now raising all 5 children alone without Amber. So the 5 children were Mara, aged 8, Elias, aged 7, Nathan, aged 6, Gabriel, aged 2, and Elaine, aged 1. Timothy was now sending his children to school because prior to this, they were homeschooled. Timothy actually made Amber homeschool the children, even though she had no qualifications and she didn't feel comfortable with homeschooling the children. But obviously, Amber is not around anymore, so he's having to send the children to school. He's also using babysitters to care for the children. I think he soon realized how much work Amber was actually doing. And unfortunately, this is when Timothy's terrible behavior started to escalate as well. His drug and alcohol usage really increased at this time. He was becoming more and more volatile, and he had also become physically abusive to the children. This all started because Timothy had started to enforce stricter methods of punishment and control. Now, previously, all of this was focused on Amber. He was physically abusing Amber, controlling Amber, enforcing these very strict rules on Amber, and it was all on Amber. The children, as far as I'm aware anyway, never actually suffered at the hands of Timothy. But now Amber's gone, so he no longer has Amber to take out his frustrations on. So now he's turned his frustrations onto his children. If the children ever did anything wrong, or what Timothy deemed as doing something wrong, they were forced to do extreme forms of exercise. And that is why I said earlier on in the case that that strict boot camp regimen, that exercise, was very important to today's case. And this is why. He would force the children to do push-ups, squats, extreme forms of exercise for children. He would also make the children stand on their tiptoes for hours. And he would make the children do hundreds of squats, hundreds of push-ups. And this is extreme for anyone, but for children. And I did just read out their ages, but the eldest child is only 8 years old. And if Timothy wasn't satisfied that the children had learnt their lesson from the extreme exercise, he would resort to physical violence. There were times when Timothy would drag the children around the house. He would whip them repeatedly with belts. He would choke the children. He would also throw them up against the wall. Food was also being withheld from the children as well. The children were barely being fed. They were lucky if they got one meal a day. And when they were fed oatmeal. That was the only thing in the house ever. On other occasions, Timothy would bring home a McDonald's, but he would bring home one chicken nugget meal for all 5 children to share between themselves. So things have really escalated here. This is extreme child abuse and neglect. And all of this was being noticed by other people. Timothy wasn't hiding any of this. He didn't care if the children had bruises on them. He didn't care who saw. The children would arrive at school with bruises on their face, necks, arms, and the teachers would ask the children, "How did you get these bruises?" And the children would openly say that their dad did it. The teachers, of course, reported Timothy to the DSS, with one report from a teacher saying that they found a hand-sized bruise on one of the children. But tragically, this report was never followed up on. What's new? Every report that was made was either never followed up on, or someone from the DSS would go out, they would make a report, and then that wouldn't get followed up on. But it wasn't just the teachers that were noticing the abuse. The babysitters were too. One time, the family went to Disneyland, and I was actually shocked when I read that. I was like, what? They actually went to Disneyland? Because that does not sound like Timothy. And on the way to Disneyland, the children were getting a little bit restless in the car, and Timothy was annoyed at this. So he pulled over and made the children do squats on the side of the road. And then when they arrived at the hotel, the babysitter witnessed Timothy spanking his children. The babysitter was absolutely traumatized by this because she had never actually witnessed this herself before. The babysitter as well would feed the children in secret. The children would say to the babysitter, "Please don't tell my dad that you fed me, because if he's found out that you fed me, he won't give us any more food." And it's just absolutely heartbreaking. And of course, the babysitter never told their dad that she had fed them. And the babysitter approached Timothy a number of times about the food, about how he would discipline the children, but every time Timothy would just fly off the handle and say, "These are my kids. I discipline them how I want to." Of course, the babysitter did report Timothy to the DSS multiple times, and again, nothing was ever done. There was one time where someone from the DSS actually bothered to go out, because most of the time they never did, and a caseworker saw with their own eyes bruises on the children. But once again, the case was closed and nothing was done. And I'm sorry, are you being serious? Right now, a caseworker went out and visibly saw with their own eyes bruises on the children, and nothing gets done. Abuse can sometimes be hidden very well, but when it's staring you in the face, why are you not doing anything? There were so many opportunities for the Department of Social Services to step in. Literally everyone is telling them Timothy is not a good person. Amber was telling them ages ago. We now have teachers phoning. We now have babysitters phoning. These children needed immediate intervention. They needed to be removed from that home. And I just want to point out here that the DSS were contacted a total number of 12 times. 12 separate times, which means that there were 12 opportunities for something to be done here, but every time nothing was ever done. And from my research, I actually don't know what happened to Amber at this point. Like, I couldn't find out anything. All I know is that Timothy was trying his hardest to prevent Amber from ever seeing the children. So we now get to August of 2014, and we are literally just weeks away from the tragic events of today's case. Another call is made to the DSS. This call reported that there was physical abuse towards the children in Timothy's home. Once again, a caseworker went out to the home and they saw that one of the children had a cut above their eye. And when Timothy was asked about how the child had received this cut, Timothy replied that the child had got it, quote, banging it on a doorknob. He also told the caseworker that he was only being reported by the babysitter because the babysitter was angry that he had just fired her. During the visit, the DSS caseworker also noted down that the children were starving. Let that sink in. The caseworker said that the children were starving. They also documented that the children had bruises on them from beatings. It was also reported that Timothy no longer wanted to send his children to a public school. Unbelievably, Timothy openly says to the DSS caseworker that he does not want to send his kids to school because the teachers keep reporting him to the DSS. How much of a bigger red flag do you need? It's so incredibly frustrating because this caseworker has literally wrote down that the children are starving, that they're being beaten, that they have bruises cut above their eye. And the conclusion of the report from the DSS caseworker said, quote, Dad appears to be overwhelmed as he is unable to maintain the home, but the children appear to be clean, groomed, and appropriately dressed. I'm sorry. What? And again, no further action was taken. I just get so angry. It's like, what the actual hell? And very tragically, just days after the last visit from that DSS caseworker, that is when the tragic events of today's case take place. On the 28th of August 2014, Timothy found his 6-year-old son, Nathan, playing with an electrical socket. Now, I should point out at this time that all children had expressed that they didn't want to live with their dad anymore. All of the children had expressed that they wanted to live with their mom. Timothy was absolutely outraged by this. How dare the children want to live with their mom? Timothy actually started to believe that the children were conspiring against him to bring him down. Now, this to me sounds absolutely absurd. The ages of the children are 1, 2, 6, 7, and 8. How are children of that age conspiring together to bring down one of their parents? Earlier on, I did say that Timothy was suffering from paranoia, so I don't know if that has something to do with this, because it's absolutely absurd to think that these children are conspiring against anyone. So Timothy found his son, Nathan, playing with the electrical socket, and Timothy believed that his son was doing this intentionally to harm his dad. I don't know how he came to that conclusion. I don't know how a child playing with an electrical socket, which is obviously dangerous, they shouldn't be doing that, but I don't know how a child doing that means that they're going to harm a parent. Like, that just doesn't make sense, does it? And in response to this, Timothy enforced an absolute awful and brutal punishment. He told Nathan to get on the ground and do some push-ups. Then when he had finished the push-ups, he had to do squats. And there were other exercises that he was forced to do as well. And then once he had finished it all, he was made to do the cycle over and over and over and over again. He is 6 years old and he is being forced into doing exercise that is like a military boot camp. He was completely exhausted, dehydrated, fatigued, and whenever Nathan would show any signs of slowing down, Timothy would whip him, forcing him to continue. And this went on for hours. He was forced to exercise for hours, and Nathan was pleading with his dad to let him stop. But Timothy would not give in. He just kept beating Nathan every time he pleaded to stop. And it's just truly heartbreaking. How can anyone do that to a child? I just cannot wrap my head around this monster. I just can't. He's just absolutely disgusting. Why? I just don't understand the reason behind this either. Like, why? So the exercise continued, and it continued until Nathan actually collapsed, and Timothy just then picked up Nathan and carried him into his room and put him on his bed, and he just left him there. And when Timothy went to check on Nathan a few hours later, very sadly, Nathan had passed away, and he passed away from severe dehydration and exhaustion. And I just can't even find the words. I can't. He did not deserve that. It's incredibly heartbreaking. Can you imagine how painful that would have been? That is truly one of the worst acts of child cruelty I think I've ever come across. And it gets worse from here. It's like, how does it get worse? So when Timothy finds Natar in his bedroom, he starts to panic. He knows that he's in serious trouble and he's likely to be prosecuted for this. So he starts evaluating his options. He first makes a Google search and ends up watching a video on prison rape. It's thought that he did this to get an idea of what prison life might be like for him. He also started to think about his other 4 children. He started to think about what's going to happen to them. If he gets sent to prison, who's going to get them? Well, the obvious answer is Amber, and Timothy could not bear the thought of Amber having custody of their children. He just couldn't even bear it. It made him so angry. He wanted to do everything in his power to stop Amber getting the kids. And this is when Timothy came to the awful conclusion that the only way to do this was to murder the other 4 children. So throughout the evening, Timothy went around his 4 children and strangled them to death. The 2 older children, Mara and Elias, aged 8 and 7, he strangled with his own hands. But then when it came to the younger 2 children, Gabriel and Elaine, aged 2 and 1, he strangled them with a belt because his hands were too big for their small necks. And once again, I just have no words. Why did he come to that conclusion? Why? Why would he murder his other 4 children? I can't even imagine what those final moments would be for those 4 children. The way he did it as well, he didn't just go round one by one, like straight after another. He actually spread out the murders throughout the night, and some of the children were actually aware of what was going on. And once Timothy had carried out these absolutely horrific murders, he only had one thing on his mind, and that was self-preservation. He showed absolutely no remorse for his crimes. The only thing that he was thinking of was covering up the murders so he could get away with it. First of all, he sent a message to his babysitter saying that him and the kids were going to be out of state for the next few days, so he didn't need her services. He then started to Google campgrounds and reservations. Timothy then wraps the bodies of all 5 children in plastic bags, loads them into his car, and drives out of state towards Alabama. He then started to make even more Google searches, and these Google searches, I can't believe it. You honestly can't. He started to Google countries that have no extradition laws. Where do you run? He also searched for how to dispose of a body. It's very clear where his mind is. He wanted to run. At one point as well, he actually did consider committing suicide, but he decided that he wasn't going to do this because if he committed suicide, he wouldn't enter heaven. I think it's safe to say that you are not getting into heaven after what you've done. Everything is just all about him. So Timothy is driving around aimlessly at this point with all 5 children in the back of the car. He is driving around for days trying to figure out what to do. Eventually, he does come to a plan and he writes it down. When you remember that he's writing this about his children, that adds another level of sick. So on the plan, he writes, day 1, burn up bodies. Day 2, sand down bones. Day 3, dissolve and discard. How can you write those words about your own children? He was even captured on camera at a Walmart buying saws, multiple saws, dust masks, goggles, acid, and a 5-gallon plastic bucket. Timothy actually did begin the process of dismembering his children. He started with Nathan, and after trying and realizing that he just couldn't do it, he abandoned his plan to dismember his children. In the end, he ended up abandoning all 5 children in plastic bags in a woodland area. Timothy thought that he would be able to get away with these heinous crimes. Thankfully, he was wrong, and law enforcement were soon about to catch up with him. So we now get to the 6th of September 2014. Timothy had now been on the run for 8 days. Now, it's not exactly known the exact day that Timothy disposed of his children's bodies, but we do know for most of those 8 days, he was driving with the bodies in the back of his car. Multiple people had reported Timothy and the children missing, including the babysitter, family members, and Amber. So the authorities were looking for him, and eventually Timothy was pulled over by just some police officers because they suspected that he was driving under the influence, which he was. He was completely intoxicated. And when these police officers ran his details through the system, they find that he is wanted in South Carolina over a child welfare issue. The police officers searched the car. There's obviously no children in the car, but the officers have reported that they smelt the stench of death. They also found blood in the car and maggots. There was also bleach and children's clothes in the back of the car. Timothy was then immediately arrested. Once taken to the police station, Timothy confessed pretty quickly, which I was surprised at. I thought he was going to really drag it out. But he did try and worm his way out of it, but we'll get to that. Timothy described how he found Nathan dead in his bedroom. He also said that he then made the decision to kill all of his children. He did throw out some things, maybe plant a few seeds in that interview. He started saying, oh, I heard voices. Voices were telling me to kill my kids. My kids were conspiring against me. That's why I killed them. He also wanted to make it very clear that these murders were not premeditated. Maybe you could say Nathan wasn't premeditated, but the other 4 children, he planned to kill them. Premeditation doesn't mean that you have to be planning the murders for weeks. Premeditation can mean that you planned it 5 minutes before. If you plan to do it, it's premeditated. Following the confession, Timothy took the officers straight to where he abandoned his children. And they found the children in plastic bags decomposing just on the side of the road, which again shows absolutely zero remorse. The fact that he just abandoned his children on the side of the road. 5 years later, in April of 2019, Timothy would finally stand trial for his crimes. I am not quite sure why it took so long to go to trial, but Timothy did plead not guilty by reason of insanity. So I assume that is why. Timothy was saying that he had undiagnosed schizophrenia. He said that he was unable to tell right from wrong at the time of the murders. And he was definitely planting the seeds in his confession for an insanity plea. However, at trial, a psychiatrist came to the conclusion that he both legally and morally knew what he was doing was wrong. He didn't have schizophrenia, and he was actually faking symptoms of schizophrenia. I imagine he was hoping that he would get away with this plea because, if you remember, his mom has schizophrenia. The prosecution argued that Timothy took very deliberate steps to cover up what he did. I mean, just look at all of his Google searches, and the actions that he took after the murder show that he did know what was right from wrong. And in the end, the jury agreed. After 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Timothy guilty of all 5 murders. And on the 13th of June 2019, Timothy Jones Jr. was sentenced to death. Following the trial, the failures of the DSS were also investigated. A report was then released that stated that South Carolina's DSS employees were unqualified, their caseloads were excessive, and the overall system was inadequate. Amber also ended up suing the DSS for their repeated failures in safeguarding her children. I agree, there were so many failures. It's hard to not point out the failures in this case. There were so many. Ultimately, the responsibility, of course, does lie with Timothy. He was an extremely messed up individual that was born out of abuse, and he then became an abuser himself. He had so many opportunities to turn his life around. He was so privileged. He had the tools to break the cycle of abuse. He went to college. He got a degree, which is a luxury. It shouldn't be a luxury, but it is. He then got a job that paid very well. He had a wife and children. He could have had it all, but he chose not to. And I just want to end the video here by paying tribute to those innocent children. They tragically lost their lives at the hands of someone that they should have been able to trust. Mara Jones had long, beautiful, chestnut brown hair, which she often referred to as her Rapunzel hair. Her family said that she had a big, bright, beautiful smile that could just light up any room she entered. She was only 8 years old. Elias Jones had beautiful blonde hair and blue eyes. He enjoyed being outdoors and enjoyed collecting all kinds of critters. His family said that he was the charmer of the family. He was only 7 years old. Nathan had dark brown hair and bright blue eyes. He wouldn't go anywhere without his stuffed animal, which he loved to snuggle. He also loved Woody from Toy Story and wanted to be a sheriff just like Woody when he grew up. He was only 6 years old. Gabriel Jones had golden blonde hair and big crystal blue eyes. He had a continuous and very contagious smile. His family said that Gabriel truly lived up to his name and he was one of a kind with an angelic and very gentle personality. He was only 2 years old. Elaine Jones had chestnut brown hair and amazing hazel-colored eyes. She always had to have her juice and blankie. She loved attention and was a sweet baby girl who always knew what she wanted. Her family said that she was truly a rainbow after a storm. She was only 1 year old. It's just absolutely heartbreaking, isn't it? Oh God, children ones always hit me hard. I just wish that someone had protected those children. I just really wish that that case hadn't happened. So today we're going to cover the case of the Coleman family murders. So this case takes place back in 2009 and Chris Coleman, he was happily married, he had 2 kids, he had a really good job, he was working as a bodyguard for a famous Christian televangelist and everything was going great for Chris. And then all of a sudden these mysterious death threats started to show up, threatening to kill Chris's whole family. And I don't want to give too much away because we're going to get into all of that in today's video, but all I will say is that Chris Coleman is the Chris Watts before Chris Watts. It's not just their first name that they have in common.
Listen, man, she wasn't alive when you left.
She was alive. She was laying right beside me.
She was not alive when you left this morning. The children weren't alive when you left this morning.
Yes, they were.
No, come on, Chris. We gotta get over this.
And just to warn you, Sassy Danielle is going to be coming out in this video because this case gets my blood boiling. Oh my God, some people. So Chris Coleman was born on the 20th of March, 1977, making him a Pisces. He grew up in Chester, Illinois, with his parents, Ron and Connie, and his 2 brothers, Brad and Keith. It's said that when Chris was growing up, he was a very well-mannered child, but he was quite quiet, he was quite reserved, he was the quietest and most reserved out of all 3 brothers. And he grew up in a very religious household. His parents were both co-pastors at a local church, and religion was a huge part of the Coleman's family life. Chris had a lot to do with the church when he was growing up. Chris also really excelled in school, but he particularly excelled in sports like athletics. He actually excelled that much that he caught the attention of a Marines recruiter when he was still in high school. And this led to Chris joining the Marines straight out of high school. And once Chris was in the Marines, he worked as a dog handler in the K9 team. And again, he really excelled at this. If there is one thing that you should know about Chris is that when it comes to academic or his job, his career or whatever, he excels. And when he was in the Marines as a dog handler, he picked up many awards, honors, certificates, etc. So Chris is a very high achiever, really, to say the least. And it was when Chris was in the Marines, when he was in his early 20s, that he met a woman called Sherry. And Sherry was a military police officer in the US Air Force. And she just happened to be studying one day at the K9 Center, and that is how she met Chris. And the 2 of them instantly hit it off. And what was just a really weird coincidence is that Sherry was also from Illinois. She lived in Chicago, which I don't think was too far from where Chris lived, I don't think, which meant that they were able to spend quite a lot of time together. So the 2 of them were kind of dating. I think it's not exactly clear when they officially started dating, but I think at this point they were officially dating and no one really knew about it. Only Chris and Sherry. They kept their relationship quite private in the beginning. And then one day Chris decided to take Sherry back to his parents' house to introduce the girl he was seeing to his parents. He didn't tell his parents though that she was his girlfriend. He just introduced her as a friend. But let's just say that this initial meeting of Sherry and Chris's parents did not go well. They did not warm to her at all. And just as a little side note, Chris's parents are part of the reason that my blood boils at this case. So I get the impression that Chris's parents were very protective over Chris. Chris was the apple of his parents' eye, and I got the impression that no one would be good enough for their perfect son. They're those kinds of parents, you know? So when Chris arrives at his parents' house to introduce Sherry to his parents, oh my God, his parents' reaction, oof, they instantly didn't like her. They're extremely judgmental. They basically just judged her. They're like looking out the window, like seeing what she looked like, and they instantly judged her by what she looked like. They didn't like that she was wearing short shorts. They also didn't like that she had tattoos on her leg. And they also didn't like the fact that Sherry wasn't very religious. And his dad has said, quote, "She's not the person we thought he would be with." And his mom was not very impressed with Sherry either.
And he came back with Sherry. What did you think?
Surprise, surprise. I was surprised. I wasn't impressed one way or the other. She was just a little blonde-headed girl to me.
So I think it's safe to say that Sherry was not going to be in for an easy ride. They're extremely judgmental. They're definitely not the kind of in-laws that anyone would want, let's just say. And that is not the end of Chris's parents in this case. Oh God, I have a lot to say about them, but we'll get to that. So Chris introduces Sherry to his parents, and like I said, he didn't introduce her as his girlfriend. I can understand why he did this, because he was probably too scared to say that she's my girlfriend. He probably knew exactly what his parents were thinking. And I don't actually have any information about what happened at this little meeting. But after Chris says that he is taking a trip to Chicago to drop Sherry home, and then a few days pass and Chris calls his dad from Chicago and he's like, "Oh, hi Dad, how are you? How are things? How's everything going? Oh, by the way, I got married to Sherry." And Chris's dad, Ron, was just like, what? Oh my God, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when he heard that news. And it turned out that Sherry was pregnant. I don't know when she found out that she was pregnant. She probably knew that she was pregnant, and Chris probably knew as well when Chris took her to meet his parents. But obviously he wasn't going to say that, was he? So because Sherry had fallen pregnant, they decided between themselves that they wanted to get married, that they should get married. And Chris's parents were not happy. This made Chris's parents dislike Sherry even more because they felt that Sherry had trapped Chris by falling pregnant. And I'm just like, did you not pay attention in biology class? Because it takes two to tango. And this is not what Sherry had done. She hadn't trapped Chris by getting pregnant. She had just fallen pregnant. And I can't believe that they were trying to blame Sherry. So Chris is now a husband. He's about to become a father. And Chris and Sherry settle into a house in Columbia, Illinois, which is about an hour from Chris's hometown. And not too long after the birth of their first child, Sherry falls pregnant again, and they have two children, two sons called Garrett and Gavin. So now that Chris's life has completely done a 180, he is a husband and he now has two kids, he feels like he wants to leave his job in the Marines. He wants something that is a bit more settled, a little bit closer to home. And this is when he found a new job as the bodyguard to famous Christian televangelist Joyce Myers. Now, I didn't know who Joyce Myers was, so from what I found out, she is one of the most famous Christian Bible teachers in the US, if not the world. She is a best-selling author as well as a television presenter, and she tours the world. She does a lot. She's a very busy person.
It's perfectly okay for you to go ahead and have a good time while God's working on your problem.
And she's pretty famous as well, and famous people need bodyguards. And this is how Chris got the job as a bodyguard, because it turns out that Joyce Myers was a family friend of the Coleman family. She had actually watched Chris grow up, so this is how he got the job as her bodyguard. So Chris starts this job and it pays well. He was getting over $100,000 a year for doing this job, and he loves this job as well because he gets to travel the world. Although I've got to say, he left the military to get a more like settled job, like, you know, traveling the world as somebody's personal bodyguard doesn't really seem like a settled job, but whatever. So he has this job, things are going great, he's excelling in his job as well, because like I said, when it comes to anything academic or career-wise, Chris really excels. He throws himself into it and he does really well, which I'm not saying that this is a trait of a psychopath, but it kind of is. When you hear like the rest of the case, I kind of think he might be a psychopath. So right now, things are going great for Chris. He has a loving wife, he has 2 amazing sons, he has this amazing job, he has this really nice house in the suburbs. He really enjoys his job as well, and everything's going great. But that doesn't exactly last for long. As the years pass, cracks start to form in Chris and Sherry's relationship. And most of the reason of the tension and the drifting apart was because of Chris's job, because he was traveling so much. I mean, he wasn't really at home very often. And to make matters worse, I've got to take a brief pause. I got to gather myself for what I'm about to say. Chris started to get angry at Sherry because she wasn't performing her wifely duties. Oh my God. So when Chris would return home from traveling, he would expect certain things, and when he didn't get it, he got very angry. And I'm just like, oh my God, the nerve of this man. Maybe if he was a decent person, maybe she would be more up for it. And it's reported that Chris started to get a wandering eye because he wasn't getting it at home, so he looked elsewhere. And this caused Sherry to distrust him, which I'm like, duh, of course it did. And to make the matters even worse for the whole family, Chris started receiving hate mail and threatening messages. And these threatening messages were directly related to his job as a bodyguard to Joyce Myers. The person sending these messages absolutely despised Joyce Myers. And the messages that Chris was receiving were saying things like, tell Joyce Myers to stop preaching her BS or I will kill your whole family. And to begin with, the threatening messages were being sent via email, but no one knew who was sending these emails. They did have an email address of the person sending the emails, and the email address was destroychris@gmail.com. Very creative. And all of the messages had a very similar message. They were, stop Joyce Myers preaching BS. If you continue supporting Joyce Myers, your family will die. Basically, all the messages threatened to kill Chris's family. And these messages started in November of 2008. And this was 10 years into Chris and Sherry's relationship. And the 2 sons that they have, Garrett and Gavin, are aged 11 and 9 at this point. And as you can imagine, Sherry was absolutely terrified because of these messages. She was so worried about her children. But no one had any idea of who was sending these messages. And what everyone just found a little bit weird was, why is this person sending Chris these messages about Joyce? Because this person clearly hated Joyce Myers. Well, then why weren't they sending these messages to Joyce Myers? Why were they sending them to her bodyguard? Things really started to escalate a few months later when Sherry found a letter in the mailbox. And it was also a threatening letter. And again, this letter threatened to kill Chris and his family. But the scariest thing about this is that this letter had no mailing address on it, meaning that it was hand delivered. So the person that was threatening Chris and his family was literally right outside the house not too long ago. And Sherry is freaking out and she makes Chris go to the police to file a report. And following this report, a detective, Justin Barlow, offered to help the family, and he actually lived on the same street as the Coleman family, and he had security cameras outside his house, and he decided to point one of those security cameras at the Coleman's house. So hopefully if the person was going to come back around the house, they would be able to catch them on his security cameras. A few days pass and nothing is caught on CCTV, no strange or weird activity. The only clips really that they have of the Coleman house is Chris out in the front garden playing catch with his 2 sons. However, on the morning of the 5th of May 2009, Justin Barlow gets a call from Chris Coleman, and Chris sounds very distressed and very panicked. This call came in at 6:40 a.m. Chris was out of the house. He was at the gym on that morning at that time, and he had been trying to call Sherry from the gym, but he couldn't get a hold of her. And he's all panicked because he can't get a hold of her. And obviously because of these threatening letters, he's like, oh my God, I don't know what is going on. I can't get a hold of Sherry. This is not like her. She normally answers. I'm worried that something terrible has happened. Can you go over to the house and check on them? And Justin Barlow agrees. He's like, of course, I'll go check on them. Like, calm down. Like, I'm sure everything is okay. And you can see on the CCTV of his security cameras at 6:51 a.m. you can see Justin Barlow approaching the Coleman house. The detective knocks on the door. No answer, so he does enter the home. He starts calling Sherry's name. Again, he's not getting any response. He starts to look around the house to see if he can find anyone at this point, because there are supposed to be 3 people in this house: Sherry and the 2 boys, Gavin and Garrett. And when he enters the bedrooms of the house, he is met with an absolutely just horrific sight. He finds Sherry and the 2 boys, Gavin and Garrett, all dead in their beds. They had been strangled to death. What was also weird is that there were messages spray painted on the walls, even on the bed of the 2 boys, which is just so horrible. Like, why would anyone spray paint on like a dead child's bed? And the words that were in spray paint said things like, you have paid, fuck you, I'm always watching. And I can't even imagine how traumatizing that would have been for the detective. Like, no one ever expects to see that, ever. And just the spray painting and just the disrespect, because he knows these people. Like, these are his neighbors. These are not strangers to him. I know he's a detective, and I know I'm sure he doesn't come across a scene like that every day, but I know he's seen pretty horrible stuff. But these are his neighbors. These are kids that he sees on a daily basis, and to walk in to their bedroom and to see both of those boys strangled to death while they slept in their bed and then spray paint everywhere, oh my God, it would have just been horrible. And of course, Sherry as well, like a neighbor that he would have seen every day as well. It's just, oh God, the whole thing is just horrible. So Detective Barlow, of course, calls this straight in, and the whole house becomes a huge crime scene. Chris arrives home from the gym, and Detective Justin Barlow has the absolute horrible job of telling Chris exactly what has happened and the fact that his whole family have been murdered. And it's never easy telling somebody that information, and he was expecting Chris to just completely lose it. But what was really surprising is that when Chris was told that his whole family had been murdered, he was weirdly calm. They expected Chris to be in pieces. They expected him to lose it. They expected him to at least ask some questions, like what happened, how did they die, like who did this, like what is going on, like just some questions, you know, like normal questions someone would ask after being told that. But he didn't even ask anything. He didn't even ask what happened, nothing. He didn't lose it. There was no emotion. He was just really calm. So the next thing that happens is the police take Chris down to the police station for questioning, so they can ask him like a few questions. Of course, the people closest to the victims are always suspects, like to begin with, and they just need to ask him some questions, just routine questions. And it's Detective Justin Barlow that is assigned to carry out the interview. I mean, I did find it a little bit weird that it was Detective Justin Barlow that was assigned to do the interview, because I thought, oh, isn't he not too close to the situation? Like, isn't that a little bit of like a conflict of interest and stuff? But then I thought, oh no, because he has a rapport with Chris, doesn't he? He knows Chris is his neighbor, and they probably think that he's going to be able to get more information out of him than someone that Chris doesn't know. So Chris starts by telling the detective that everything was fine. His family were alive, basically, when he left to go to the gym in the morning. Detective Justin Barlow asked, did anything suspicious happen in the last 24 hours? Chris was like, no, everything was normal, everything was fine.
Last night, did you guys get any kind of argument or anything?
No, it was awesome. She fell asleep in my arms on the couch. If I just been there this morning.
The detective then noticed some scratch marks on Chris's arm, and he asks Chris, like, where did those scratches come from? And Chris all of a sudden started acting shifty. And Chris was like, oh, I got angry when I was in the ambulance and I started punching a pillow. Since when does anyone punch a pillow and get scratch marks on their arm? Like, surely he should have come up with a better story than that. And the detective at this point is just like, yeah, okay. Okay, I think we have a suspect here. I don't know if the detective thought that Chris was guilty at this point, but he definitely thought that Chris was hiding something and he knew more than he was letting on.
But did anything else happen that you're not telling me? Chris, I'm getting the sense that you're not being 100% truthful.
So as the interview is going on, the crime scene, the house, is obviously being looked at. And information is coming into Detective Justin Barlow all of the time. And a huge discovery is made. The time of death of all 3 victims was before 3 a.m.
When you left the house this morning, was your wife alive?
Oh, yeah.
What would you say if I told you that I don't think she was?
I don't know what to tell you. I mean, I think she was.
Which completely contradicted everything that Chris said, because Chris said that his family were alive when he left for the gym at 5:43 a.m. So the time of death was hours before apparently Chris left for the gym. And when Chris is confronted with this in the interview, he starts getting all whiny, he starts putting on a voice. He basically starts acting like a toddler because Chris thinks if he acts like this, he'll get what he wants.
Listen, man, she wasn't alive when you left.
She was alive. She was laying right beside
Listen
me.
to me. We can go back and forth with this all day long, but the physical evidence doesn't lie, man. She was not alive when you left this morning. The children weren't alive when you left this morning.
Yes, they were.
No, come on, Chris. We gotta get over this.
But not only that, the CCTV footage that would have been captured from Detective Justin Barlow's house showed absolutely no one entering or leaving that house. The only person that was caught on the CCTV leaving the house was Chris. But the shocking discoveries don't stop there. So the police initially start investigating the threatening emails and messages that Chris was getting because they thought, okay, is this person responsible for killing the whole family? Because they were definitely threatening to. Or the police traced the IP address of the emails, and it turns out that the emails were sent from Chris's own laptop. Yeah, that's right. Chris was the one sending himself and his own family these death threats from the email address destroychris@gmail.com. Like I said, that is a very creative email address. It's like, could he not have thought of anything better? And the police also found evidence that he had created that email address on his own laptop as well. So it turns out that the family were never receiving death threats. It was just Chris sending them to himself. And the police were just really confused at this point because they were like, well, why is he sending these death threats to himself? Like, why would anyone do that? Why would Chris send death threats to his own family? But also, why would he murder his whole family? And it doesn't take long for the detectives to get to the bottom of the reason why. Chris had a mistress. Chris had been having an affair behind his wife's back. And when the police started going through Chris's phone records and emails, it didn't take them long to figure out who he was having an affair with. And I've just got to stop doing my makeup for a second because we need to brace ourselves again. So it turns out that the woman that Chris was having an affair with was Sherry's best friend from high school. It's like one thing to have an affair, but to have an affair with the best friend from high school, what? It's like there are so many other people, like, don't have an affair, but like if you're gonna have an affair, there are so many other people, like why would you go there? And when the police looked through the emails and the phone records, they realized that this affair had been going on for months. So do you remember with Chris's job, he would fly around the world with Joyce Myers? Well, it turns out that when he was flying all around the world, he was flying out his mistress, whose name is Tara, by the way. I didn't say, did I? Yeah, he was flying Tara out whenever he was on work trips so he could spend time with her. And the two of them were living it up, going on lavish luxury dates, having all of these fancy meals, getting all dressed up, being all romantic, all behind Sherry's back. Initially, Chris tried to deny the affair, which I don't know why he did that. I mean, he's not stupid, okay? Like, he's pretty intelligent. Surely he would have known that they had all of this evidence.
Had you seen anyone else outside of your wife in a romantic way?
No. Tara in Florida, I've talked to her a ton lately, but...
And what's with that? I mean, what's
just a friend, somebody to talk to.
A close friendship. But were you actually... doing anything that you felt wouldn't be approved by your wife?
Some of the conversations.
But he couldn't keep up the act for too long because police came across X-rated photos and videos of both Tara and Chris that they had been sending each other, and all of this was on Chris's laptop, as well as a recording of Chris that he was filming himself professing his love for Tara as well.
Anyway, just wanted to say I love you, and as you can hear, what's funny is you are messaging me now. Said, show me your picture, say I love my hair today. Look at you look so hot.
And they believe that his affair with Tara was the reason, the motive behind the murders. But for some reason, they don't have enough evidence right now to charge him with the murders, so they let him go while they build their case. I mean, I know I'm not a detective or anything, but I feel like they've got a lot of evidence already to charge him at least. But whatever. So they keep digging into the affair because they think that that is the motive. They concentrate on that. And on Chris's laptop, like, I just find this so creepy. There was so much information about Tara, like her measurements, like everywhere, and her underwear size and her ring size. He was buying her rings. They were looking at rings together. Chris did buy Tara a promise ring because they were planning on getting married at some point. Apparently Chris and Tara had already decided on a wedding date. It's like he's married. Like, you're getting a bit ahead of yourself, aren't you? I just found this really weird. There was a list of baby names on Chris's laptop of the names that he wanted to call his children with Tara. It's like, why don't you be a good dad to your own two sons that you already have? And then this just makes my blood boil. Oh my God. I'm gonna have to hold my tongue here. So at the funeral of Sherry and Gavin and Garrett, Chris did attend, but the whole time he was texting Tara. He was just saying how much he loved her and how much he missed her. And I'm just like, for 1 second, put your goddamn phone down. You are at the funeral of your wife and your two sons that you murdered. At least show a little bit of respect and stop texting your mistress. So the police are now thinking, okay, we need to speak to Tara about all of this. So the police go to Tara's home to speak to her there first. They ask her if she was having an affair with Chris, like what are all the details? And she is nothing like Chris because he was trying to hide the affair. No, she is spilling all of the details.
How long have you been in a relationship with Chris?
Since late November, early December.
Where all you guys been together?
Phoenix and Hawaii, Maui.
What would you tell his wife when he was gone?
He would have just told that he was working.
So Sherry was not aware of the affair that you and him were having?
No, initially suspected, but he always would take pictures when he was going to sleep to prove that he wasn't sleeping with her or anything.
See, now to us, he tried to paint it as a rosy, perfect marriage.
No, they never kissed, never hugged.
I just heard on some wedding sites and stuff, looked at some rings.
I looked at stuff, but with his job, he can't be living with anybody unless he's married.
Had you guys ever talked about having children together?
Mm-hmm.
Without remorse, she openly, almost proudly, tells the police that her and Chris were in love, that they were looking at rings together, they were planning on having children. She just really has no shame. It's actually disgusting. So during the interview, her work phone her up and are like, are you coming into work today? And she responds in the weirdest way. Like, oh my God, I can't. I will insert the clip so you can see it because I can't put into words how bizarre that is.
It's Tara. Hey, no, I'm in the middle of a really high-profile murder investigation. I've got a murder investigation. I'm right in the middle of it. I have 4 detectives here sitting at my house. They have no problem giving you proof or anything like that. I thought I was coming into work today.
It's like, I get that she's got to inform her work that she's not coming in and stuff, but the way she says it and the way she goes about it is just so... It's weird, like, oh God, no. The police do bring Tara in at a different time as well to interview her down at the police station. And again, her behavior is just bizarre. Just the whole thing is bizarre. Like, it's like, does she not understand that there is a murder investigation here? Chris's wife and his 2 children have been murdered. I just can't get my head around it. And as well, because at this point, remember that Chris hasn't formally been charged with the murders yet. So Chris is just like out and everything. So when Tara is in the interview room, Chris actually texts her. And then Tara is in the interview room receiving this text from Chris. And she just comes out and tells the detective like, oh, Chris has just texted me. He's texted me how much he loves me, blah, blah, blah. And it's like time and a place. It's just inappropriate. I just don't understand.
I got a text. I know. You know that. He texted me. I just thought I'd tell you. He does.
What do you want now?
Just said he was thinking about me and that the wake was at 3 tomorrow.
She's acting so casual about the whole thing. And I can't work out if it's just fake, like she's just faking this nonchalant behavior, like she's just trying to put across that she's innocent, or she really just doesn't care and has no shame. I don't know which one it is. The police also obviously grill her if she knew about the plan to murder Chris's family, and as soon as they get onto this topic, her behavior changes. Like you can see in her body language, it just switches.
Did Chris tell you anything about these, or that he was planning anything like this?
Absolutely
Did you
not.
have any knowledge of these homicides?
No knowledge.
Before,
So-
like it or not, unfortunately, your name is Tara Motive.
Exactly.
So before she was acting all nonchalant, she was like relaxed, the way she was sitting, like everything. And then as soon as the detectives start questioning her about the murder and if it was planned and all stuff like that, her body language changes. She crosses her arms, she crosses her legs, like she keeps crossing them and uncrossing them. And she's also like really holding the chair really tight and like pushing back like this, literally as if she wants the room to swallow her, like she wants to get out. Now, I'm not saying that that is like evidence of her guilt or whatever. I just found it really bizarre how you can literally see with your own eyes her change in behaviour in her body language. I bet you're all dying to know, aren't you, how Chris's parents reacted to these accusations. To no surprise, they both tried to deny the whole thing. They both tried to deny the affair with Tara, and of course they're going to deny the murders. So Chris's dad, Ron, first tries to deny the affair, tried to deny that it ever happened. And then when he clearly figured out that he could no longer deny it, like there was just so much evidence, he tried to blame Sherry for the affair, saying that she wasn't performing her wifely duties. That wifely duties again. And this meant that she didn't respect Chris.
Tara was just meeting a need that Sherry at the time wasn't taken care of.
But I don't understand.
Well, I mean, every man's got his desires and every man has to be respected. It's built into every man. If your wife doesn't respect you, then you're going to find respect someplace else.
So are you saying that Sherry was a bad wife?
Just at that short, brief time, she had stepped back from doing her job as a wife.
I just have no words for this man. I really don't. Remember that he's a pastor. I just feel like that's important. And he's basically saying that because Sherry wasn't having sex with Chris, that means that she doesn't respect him. Yes, I know. He's really saying that sex equals respect. My God. And because Sherry is not giving the respect that Chris deserves, then Chris has every right to search for that respect somewhere else. It's not too hard, is it, to figure out why Chris turned out the way he did? Let's just say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. But it gets worse. I wish it didn't, but it does. So the police search Ron's laptop. I don't know why they search Ron's laptop. Maybe they just want to be thorough. Maybe they had a suspicion that something might be on there. But thank God they did search it, because on Ron's laptop, the police find naked pictures of Tara. I know, you can't make this stuff up.
Since going through your phone
Okay.
and computer, and obviously we've done the same with Chris's and even his dad's. And
Right.
there happens to be a picture of you rather compromising on his father's computer.
Okay.
So
That's pretty interesting.
yeah.
I don't know anything about that.
Well, it turns out that Chris had been sharing the X-rated pictures of Tara with his dad. I wonder what Ron's wife had to say about that. Anyway, back to the story. So remember that Chris hasn't been charged yet for any of the murders. Well, the police are still working on their investigation and building their case against him. And they do find quite a lot more evidence, and it doesn't look good for Chris. They found Chris's DNA under Sherry's fingernails. Do you remember those scratches that Chris had on his arm that he said that he got from punching a pillow? Well, big surprise, they didn't come from a pillow. They came from Sherry, literally fighting for her life. Police also found a receipt in the house for the can of spray paint. Remember that there was spray paint everywhere. Chris was also seen by a neighbor disposing of his family's possessions just a few days after the murder. They also found texts on Sherry's phone where she was texting a friend saying that Chris had been asking for a divorce recently. She was also telling her friend that she was super suspicious of Chris, like he was acting strange lately. Sherry also told her friend that if something bad ever happened to her, Chris did it. So on the 19th of May 2009, the police finally arrest Chris and charge him for 3 counts of first-degree murder. So at trial, all of the evidence was presented. They said how Chris had lied about the time of death and that he was actually at home at the time of death, not at the gym like he had said. They also said that he had been sending himself these death threats and that the email address was made by him. They also obviously talked about the affair, the secret affair with Tara and everything. But the one thing that everybody couldn't get their head around was why? Why did Chris kill his wife and his 2 sons? Like, why? Yes, he was having an affair, but that still doesn't explain why he did what he did. Well, it turns out that, remember Chris's job? He worked for the famous Christian televangelist Joyce Meyer. And Chris believed that if he got a divorce, that he would get fired from his job. So that is why he cooked up this whole plan to murder his wife. I don't know why he murdered his 2 sons. Also, he would become a widow and then he would be able to marry Tara and keep his job. I mean, that's what they're saying the motive is. I just don't get why he murdered 2 innocent children. Like, why? I mean, Sherry was innocent as well. I'm not saying that, but children, his own children, why would he murder them? Tara also turned up at trial to testify, and can you believe she even had the nerve to wear the promise ring that Chris had given her to the trial? Chris's defense obviously said he was innocent, and they were pushing the narrative that it was this mystery man that was sending the death threats that murdered his wife and his 2 sons. They said someone had hacked his computer to send the emails, and they also accused the science, the science of being wrong about the time of death. But in the end, the jury didn't believe any of this BS. I mean, thank God. And the jury came back with a guilty verdict, and Chris was sentenced to 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. And as the verdict was announced, there were crowds outside of the courtroom and cheers erupted. And you know what? I wish I was there because I'd be cheering as well. After the sentencing, Chris has continued to plead his innocence. He continues with the theory of this mystery man that was sending the death threats. They were the one that murdered his family.
Did you kill your wife and your 2 boys because you wanted a life with your mistress?
No, absolutely not. I am 100% innocent. I believe, and I have no doubt whatsoever, it is the person that matches the unknown fingerprints and the unknown footprints and the unknown DNA at the crime scene.
And he still insists that the science was wrong.
As the body has deceased, it's at the body's normal temperature, and as it cools down to room temperature, the rate that it cools slows down. It actually comes back to 5:47 in the morning is the time of the decease.
5:47, and you left at 5:45?
Yes.
Chris has been trying to get a retrial ever since 2011, thankfully unsuccessfully. Like even last year, he was again denied a retrial. And of course, Chris's parents are still denying everything and are still saying that Chris is completely innocent. I mean, did we expect anything less from them? I just think this whole case pretty much just reeks of privilege. I don't know this. This is me just assuming things maybe, but I just feel like Chris has gone through his whole life and he's never been held accountable for anything that he has done. He is used to getting what he wants. He's used to getting his own way. He's used to lying. He's used to just whining and moaning like a toddler and everyone doing what he wants. So does this whole case remind anybody of Chris Watts? Because it literally is the same thing. Similarities are crazy, apart from the first name, obviously, which is just so weird. They were both around the same age, 32 and 33 at the time of the murders. They both murdered their whole family. their wife and 2 kids by strangulation. They both had 2 young children. Chris Watts had 2 young daughters. Chris Coleman had 2 young sons. They both had mistresses on the side, and both of them had X-rated photos and content of their mistress. The motive that both of them had was to start this new life with their mistress as well. And in both cases, Chris Watts and Chris Coleman, their parents are trying to plead their innocence and trying to say that they did nothing wrong. So this case really is Chris Watts before Chris Watts. It happened 10 years prior to the Chris Watts case, but it is nowhere near as well known. And the only thing that I can think of is that Chris Watts happened in 2018 in like the height of social media. Like everyone has social media, everyone's on their phones, everyone's on the internet. And the case of Chris Coleman happened in 2009, where social media and everything was in its infancy. And I just don't get what possesses these people to murder their whole family. Why do these people not know the word divorce? I just don't get why these people think that the only answer is murder. Like, how does one think like that? And there is no doubt in my mind, not that I'm diagnosing him, but there is no doubt in my mind that Chris Coleman and Chris Watts, but this video is about Chris Coleman. Chris Coleman is a psychopath. And what happened to Sherry and Garrett and Gavin is just absolutely heartbreaking. And Chris is just still like pleading his innocence, trying to get out. And it's just like, oh, just admit what you did. It's like, stop making this all about you. But he's a narcissist, so he doesn't know how to do that. And my heart goes out to Sherry, Gavin and Garrett's family. I hope they're okay. And I just wish that Chris would just admit what he did and just come out with it, you know, give the family some closure. I had a lot of opinions in this video. I'm never one to shy away from my opinions, but I want to know all of your thoughts, theories and opinions. Let me know in the comments down below. And don't forget to let me know your case suggestions. Leave them down below because I always want to know what you want to hear next. And I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.